Welcome to Netheric Horror. Close your eyes, embrace the darkness, and let tonight's true scary stories begin. Sweet dreams, if you dare. This happened to me last summer, back when I was staying at my parents' house for the holidays, the way I usually did once or twice every single year, whenever I got enough time off to make the trip worthwhile. It always felt a little strange coming back to that house after being away for so long, sleeping in the same childhood bedroom I had grown up in, walking down the same hallway I had walked down 1,000 times before, everything simultaneously familiar and slightly different in small ways I could never quite put my finger on. There was always some small thing that had changed since my last visit. A piece of furniture rearranged in the living room, a new coat of paint somewhere. Small, ordinary shifts that reminded me my parents' life kept moving forward even during the long stretches when I was not there to witness it happening. Small details I always noticed within the first few minutes of walking back through the front door. My sister still lived there full-time, in her old room just down the hall from mine, and whenever I visited, we usually fell back into the same easy rhythm we had always had growing up together. Staying up too late talking, raiding the kitchen for snacks long after our parents had gone to bed, the two of us slipping right back into old habits, like no time had passed at all since the last visit. It was around 3 in the morning, and I was still awake in my room, sitting at my computer the way I often did on those late nights when the rest of the house had already gone quiet, and I finally had some uninterrupted time to myself. My phone was sitting right there beside the keyboard, and when it suddenly lit up with an incoming call, I glanced over at the screen and saw my sister's name displayed there. That alone struck me as a little strange, even before anything else happened that night. My sister's room is just down the hallway from mine, close enough that she could have simply walked over and knocked on my door or called out through the wall if she really needed to get my attention about something. There had never really been a need for either of us to actually phone the other one late at night, not when our rooms sat so close together in the same familiar hallway we had both grown up, walking back and forth along more times than either of us could count. We had spent our entire childhoods in those two rooms, close enough that we used to pass notes back and forth under the shared wall between them when we were kids, close enough that calling each other on the phone had genuinely never once occurred to either of us before. Not for anything, not even as some kind of joke. Still, I did not think much of it in that first moment, just assuming she wanted to ask me something and had grabbed her phone out of habit rather than bothering to get up and come find me in person. I reached over and picked up the phone to answer, but by the time I actually got it up to my ear, the call had already ended. The screen just showed the call had disconnected. No explanation. Nothing on my end suggesting I had done anything wrong in how quickly I answered. I remember glancing at the timer on the screen, too, out of some reflexive habit, and it showed the call had lasted barely a second, not nearly long enough for anything to have actually connected on either end before it cut off completely. I sat there for a second, a little confused, staring at the screen, wondering if maybe she had hung up by accident, or changed her mind about whatever she was calling to ask, or simply gotten distracted by something else in the moment before I could pick up. Figuring that she probably still wanted to talk to me about whatever had prompted the call in the first place, I got up from my desk and made my way down the short stretch of hallway toward her room. Not particularly worried at that point, more just mildly curious about what she might need at 3 in the morning. The hallway was dark and quiet the way it always was that late at night. The familiar creak of the floorboards under my feet, the only sound accompanying me as I walked the short distance between our two doors. The same handful of steps I had walked more times over the course of my life than I could ever hope to count. Past the same family photos hung along the wall that I had stopped really noticing years ago. As soon as I reached her door, before I had even had the chance to knock or say anything at all, I heard her start screaming from inside, her voice raw and absolutely terrified, saying over and over that someone was in the room with her. The sound of it hit me like a physical wave. Any lingering sleepiness or calm curiosity I had carried down that hallway instantly gone, replaced by a jolt of pure adrenaline that had me moving before I had even fully processed what I was hearing. I did not hesitate for even a second. I pushed the door open and burst inside, my heart already pounding, fully prepared to confront whoever might actually be in there with her. There was nobody there. I checked the room as quickly and thoroughly as I could manage in that first frantic rush of adrenaline, looking under the bed, checking behind the door, glancing toward the closet, but there was absolutely no sign of anyone else having been in that room at all. The window was still latched shut from the inside, the closet door still closed the way it always was. Nothing at all disturbed or out of place anywhere in that small, familiar bedroom that would suggest anyone besides my sister had set foot in it that night. My sister was sitting bolt upright in her bed, visibly shaking, tears streaming down her face, and it took a few long minutes of me sitting there with her, talking softly, before she managed to calm down enough to actually explain what had happened. Once she finally stopped crying enough to get the words out clearly, she told me that she had woken up suddenly, for no particular reason she could identify, and had opened her eyes to find a dark shadow positioned just centimeters away from her face, close enough that she said she could have reached out and touched it if she had dared to move at all. She described it as darker than the rest of the room around it, a shape without any real detail she could point to. No eyes, no mouth, nothing that looked distinctly human beyond the general impression of a head and shoulders hovering there in the dark, close enough that she said she could almost feel a faint coldness coming off of it. Though she admitted afterward that part might have simply been her own fear, amplifying every small sensation in that moment, her whole body flooded with adrenaline before she had even fully processed what she was seeing. That was the exact moment, she said, that she had started screaming. The shock and terror of finding something that close to her in the dark, overwhelming any other instinct she might have had in that instant. I told her, still trying to piece together the sequence of events myself, that she had called me right before all of this happened, that I had seen her name on my phone and had come straight to her room because of it. I even pulled out my own phone right there in front of her to show her the screen, the call log clearly still displaying her contact name and the exact timestamp of when it had come through. She looked at me with obvious confusion, insisting that could not possibly be true. She told me her phone was not even in her room, that she had been sleeping the entire time and had not touched her phone at any point that night before waking up to that shadow hovering over her face. She was so certain of this, so completely unshaken in her insistence, despite everything else she had just been through, that I found myself starting to doubt my own memory of the last several minutes, wondering for a moment whether I had somehow imagined the whole thing myself. We went downstairs together to check, both of us still barefoot and half in shock, moving carefully through the quiet, dark house the way you do when you are trying not to wake anyone else up despite everything that has just happened. And sure enough, her phone was exactly where she said it would be, sitting inside her purse on the kitchen counter, nowhere near her bedroom at all, fully charged and showing no recent activity on the screen that would suggest she had used it to call anyone in the last several hours. We both stood there for a moment, just staring at it, sitting there, untouched, the screen dark and locked exactly the way she had apparently left it hours earlier before going to sleep, offering absolutely no explanation for what either of us had just experienced upstairs. That alone was strange enough on its own, but the detail that has genuinely stuck with me the most, the part I still cannot fully wrap my head around, even now, is that when I checked my own phone, the call log clearly showed an incoming call from her number at exactly the time I remembered receiving it. Her contact photo and name displayed right there in plain, ordinary detail, exactly the way any normal call from her would have appeared 100 times before. But when we checked her phone, there was no matching outgoing call listed anywhere in her own call history. Nothing at all. Not a missed call, not a failed call, not even the faintest trace of an attempted connection anywhere in her logs. As far as her phone was concerned, she had never called me that night, and yet mine showed in plain black and white that the call had happened. We stood there in that kitchen for a long while, both of us scrolling back and forth between our two phones, comparing screens, trying to find some logical explanation for the discrepancy. My sister kept refreshing her call log over and over, as though the missing call might suddenly appear if she just checked one more time, while I kept zooming in on my own screen, checking and rechecking the timestamp and the number attached to it, making absolutely sure I was not somehow misreading it. Maybe a glitch with the carrier. Maybe some strange delay in how the call history synced. Maybe any number of technical explanations that we tried to talk ourselves into accepting so that we would not have to sit with the alternative. We even briefly considered whether some old contact or spoofed number could have somehow displayed her name and photo without actually being her, though neither of us could come up with a reasonable explanation for why anyone would do that, or how they would have gotten her exact contact photo to display correctly on my screen in the first place. A detail that felt impossible to fake, given how specific and personal that photo was. One she had taken herself just a few months earlier. None of those explanations ever fully satisfied either of us. Not really. Not when we thought about the timing of it all. The fact that the call had come through at exactly the moment leading up to her seeing that shadow, and had ended the instant I actually managed to answer it. We never did manage to properly explain what happened that night. Not the shadow she saw hovering so close to her face, and certainly not the mysterious call that appeared clearly in my phone's history while leaving absolutely no trace at all in hers. My sister slept in my room with me for the rest of that visit, neither of us willing to say it out loud directly, but both of us understanding, without discussing it further, that she simply was not going back to sleeping alone in that room again anytime soon. Not after something that specific and that unexplainable had happened to her there. We pulled the mattress off my old trundle bed and set it up on the floor beside mine, and for the rest of the week we stayed up later than either of us probably should have, talking quietly in the dark about anything except what had happened. Both of us silently grateful for the company, even though neither of us admitted it outright. Some nights we would just leave the television on low in the background. Some old comfort show neither of us was really watching, just for the sake of having a little extra light and noise filling the room instead of total silence and darkness. Neither of us brought up the shadow or the phone call again that week, not directly, though I noticed her glancing toward the closet more than once before finally settling down to sleep each night, and I cannot say I blamed her for it, given that some part of me was doing exactly the same thing. I did eventually tell my parents about it the next morning, though I could tell from their reaction that they were not entirely sure what to make of it either. My mom, ever practical, suggested it had probably been some strange technical glitch combined with a particularly vivid nightmare, a reasonable enough explanation on paper that neither my sister nor I ever quite managed to fully believe ourselves, especially not after having actually held both phones side by side in that kitchen and seen the discrepancy with our own eyes. My dad, on the other hand, went quiet for a moment before admitting, almost reluctantly, that he had experienced something similar himself once, years earlier in that same house, though he never elaborated much further on it, no matter how many times I tried to ask him about it afterward, always brushing the question off with a small, uncomfortable laugh, and a change of subject. The same way he tended to deflect any topic he clearly did not want to spend much time discussing. I have wondered since then whether there was more to that admission than he was willing to share, some older story about that house that he had simply decided, long ago, was better left unspoken, tucked away somewhere he did not particularly want to revisit, even for the sake of his own children asking. Even now, whenever the holidays roll back around and I find myself back at my parents' house again, I notice a small, involuntary hesitation whenever I walk past her old bedroom door late at night. Some part of me still half expecting, in some strange and irrational corner of my mind, to hear that same screaming start up again from behind it. My sister has told me more than once that she still cannot fully close her eyes in that room without picturing that same dark shape she says she saw, so close to her face that night, still perfectly clear in her memory no matter how much time has passed since. She eventually moved back into her old room a few months after it happened, mostly out of necessity, rather than any real sense that she had fully gotten over what happened. Though she has admitted since then that she still keeps a small lamp plugged in and left on low every single night, something she never used to bother with before, and that she still, occasionally, wakes up in the middle of the night convinced, for just a moment, that something is standing there, watching her before her eyes fully adjust to the dark and confirm that the room is empty. She has told me that the fear never fully went away, just softened over time into something more manageable, a low background hum of unease rather than the sharp, immediate terror she felt that first night, and that she has simply learned to live alongside it the way you eventually learn to live alongside anything you cannot fully explain or resolve, folding it quietly into the ordinary rhythm of everyday life rather than letting it stop her from living there entirely. And I still have that call sitting there in my old phone's history. A call that, according to every piece of evidence on her end, simply should not exist at all. I have thought more than once about deleting it, about clearing that entry out of my call log just so I would stop seeing it every time I happen to scroll back far enough. But some part of me has never quite been able to bring myself to actually do it, as though keeping that small, unexplainable piece of evidence is somehow important, even though neither my sister nor I have ever come close to figuring out what it actually means. Every so often, usually late at night when I am scrolling through my phone for some unrelated reason, I stumble across that old entry again. Her name and photo sitting there next to a timestamp from 3 in the morning, and each time I feel that same small, uncomfortable jolt all over again. The same unanswered question sitting there quietly at the edge of my mind, refusing to resolve itself no matter how many times I turn it over. When I was in high school, I had a really good, close friend who lived right next door to a house that always seemed to be up for sale, no matter how much time passed or how many different families supposedly kept moving in and out of it. We had known each other since elementary school, close enough that I practically spent as much time at his place as I did my own, riding my bike over there almost every single weekend, and plenty of weekday afternoons, too, once school let out. People would move out in the middle of the night without a word to anyone. No goodbye. No moving truck arriving during regular daylight hours the way normal families packed up and left. Just an empty house one morning where there had been a lived-in one the evening before. That house had not kept the same owner for more than 6 months straight in the entire couple of years leading up to that particular night, which even as teenagers we found strange enough to talk about from time to time, though neither of us had ever really thought seriously about looking into it further before that night. We were really bored one evening, the kind of restless, aimless boredom that only really exists in high school when you have too much free time and not nearly enough interesting ways to fill it, and my friend suggested, almost as a joke at first, that we go explore the house next door since it had been sitting empty for a while by that point. We had been sitting in his room for at least an hour already, cycling through the same handful of ideas for what to do that evening and rejecting each one for being too boring or too much effort. And by the time he suggested the house, I think we were both just desperate enough for something different, that even a slightly ridiculous idea started sounding appealing. I remember laughing about it initially, treating it as one of those ideas that gets floated and then quietly dropped in favor of something less risky. But the more we talked about it, the more it started to feel like an actual plan, rather than just idle talk. The two of us slowly talking each other into it, the way teenagers always seem to do when boredom outweighs good judgment. We walked around to the back of the house together, staying low and quiet, out of some instinct neither of us needed to explain to the other, even though there was genuinely no one around at that hour to notice or care what we were doing. The backyard was overgrown in that particular way empty houses tend to get after a while. Grass grown too tall. A couple of dead patches where something had clearly stopped being watered months earlier, the whole space carrying that slightly neglected feeling that made it obvious, even without going inside first, that nobody had been living there for some time. There was a small dog door built into the back door of the house, a leftover from whichever previous owner had once had a pet living there years earlier. And my friend, being smaller and more flexible than me at the time, managed to crawl through it without too much trouble, muttering something about how glad he was that none of the neighbors happened to be looking out their windows at that exact moment. From the inside, he reached up and unlocked the back door properly, swinging it open to let me in the normal way, rather than having me try to squeeze through that same small opening myself. The house itself, once we were both standing inside it, was really unremarkable in almost every way. It looked like it had been built sometime around the 1950s. A craftsman-style house, sitting in an older, nicer part of town. The kind of neighborhood with mature trees lining the street and houses that had clearly been built with more care and character than the newer developments going up elsewhere around town. My friend's own house next door had been built in a similar style around the same era. So stepping inside this one felt oddly familiar in certain ways, like walking through a slightly distorted version of a house I already half knew, the layout close enough to his own place that I could almost predict where each doorway would lead before we actually got there. The kitchen had this really nice built-in breakfast table set up against a large picture window. The kind of cozy little nook that probably would have been someone's favorite spot in the house back when it was properly lived in, back before it started cycling through owners every few months, for reasons nobody in the neighborhood ever seemed to fully understand. There were still faint marks on the wall nearby where picture frames had clearly once hung. Small rectangles of slightly less faded paint marking, where family photos or artwork had probably sat for years before whoever last lived there packed everything up and disappeared without a trace. The house's electricity had been shut off completely, leaving the whole place dark inside except for whatever light managed to filter in from outside. But you could still see the glow of the streetlight out front coming through that picture window well enough to make out the shapes of things around us without needing a flashlight. My friend and I sat down on the floor across from that breakfast table, right there in the dim glow coming through the window, and we just started hanging out, talking about whatever teenagers usually end up talking about when they have nowhere else in particular to be, and no real agenda beyond killing time together. I genuinely could not tell you now what specifically we were even discussing. Nothing important enough to stick in my memory the way everything that happened afterward did, just the ordinary, meandering kind of conversation you have with a close friend when you are simply enjoying each other's company without any particular purpose behind it. The kind of talk that drifts easily from one small topic to the next without either of you really noticing the time passing around. I do not know exactly how long we had been sitting there like that, comfortable and unbothered, before everything changed all at once. 10 minutes, maybe 15, enough time that I had fully settled into the strange, quiet comfort of sitting on a stranger's kitchen floor in an empty house, chatting with my best friend like we would in either of our own bedrooms. The initial nervous excitement of sneaking in having worn off completely by that point. All of a sudden, my friend screamed, a sharp, sudden sound that cut through our quiet conversation without any warning at all. And in that exact same instant, my vision went completely black. It was not simply that I could not see anything. The way your eyes might struggle briefly in total darkness before slowly adjusting. This was different, total and immediate, like something had reached out and simply switched my sight off entirely, replacing it with nothing but blackness. A darkness so complete it did not even carry the faint shifting shapes and shadows your eyes normally produce, even in a pitch-dark room. Along with that sudden blindness came an overwhelming, sickly coldness that seemed to engulf my entire body all at once, spreading from my head down to my toes in a way that felt far too fast and far too complete to be any kind of ordinary chill. I started screaming too, unable to help it, my body reacting on pure instinct to something my mind could not begin to process or explain in that moment. Every part of me suddenly convinced, without any clear reason, that something was very wrong and getting worse by the second. In the middle of that screaming, I felt my friend's hand grab hold of mine, gripping tight and pulling me forcefully in some direction I could not see or properly orient myself toward, my body stumbling along after him more by feel than by any real sense of where I was actually going. My vision slowly started to return after what felt like an unbearably long stretch of time. Though it was probably only a matter of seconds in reality, and along with my sight coming back, I gradually began to feel myself warming up again. That sickly, penetrating coldness slowly draining back out of my body the same way it had rushed in, leaving behind an odd, hollow ache in its place that took a good while longer to fully fade. It was only once I had mostly come back to myself that I realized we were now standing outside, right under the glow of the streetlight in front of the house. The cold December night air actually feeling noticeably warmer against my skin than whatever had just been inside that house, which struck me immediately as deeply wrong given that it was the middle of winter and should have been the other way around entirely. I finally managed to look over at my friend properly, and the expression on his face stopped whatever half-formed question I had been about to ask. He looked genuinely terrified, more scared than I had ever seen him look before in all the years we had known each other, his eyes wide, his whole body still tense the way you look right after narrowly escaping something dangerous. His hands still gripping my arm tightly, as though some part of him was not yet ready to let go and confirm we were both actually safe. I was confused and more than a little panicked myself at that point, my mind still catching up with everything that had just happened, but I managed to finally ask him what exactly had happened back there. Why he had screamed. Why we were suddenly standing outside instead of sitting on that kitchen floor. He told me, his voice still shaky, that while I had been talking, seemingly completely unaware of anything happening around me, a black shape, some kind of figure, had crawled out from underneath that breakfast table we had been sitting across from. He said he had noticed it first as just a slight movement in the darkness beneath the table, something he almost dismissed as a trick of the shadows or the faint streetlight coming through the window, right up until it kept moving, low and deliberate, out from under the table and directly toward where I was sitting. He described it as being entirely black, with only the vague, suggested shape of a girl. No real detail beyond that basic outline. No face he could make out clearly. No clothing. Nothing but that dark, featureless form moving with clear intention, and he said it had crawled directly toward me and climbed up onto me, sitting there on top of me while I apparently kept right on talking, seemingly completely unaware that anything at all was happening. He said that once it had settled onto me, I had started groping around blindly with my hands, my eyes wide open the entire time, but clearly seeing absolutely nothing, moving the way someone moves when they have suddenly and completely lost their sight and are trying desperately to orient themselves using touch alone. He said watching me do that, completely calm on the surface but clearly disoriented underneath, was somehow even more disturbing to witness than the black shape itself had been. My blank, unfocused expression staying eerily neutral, even as my hands moved around, searching for something to hold on to. He told me he had been so thoroughly freaked out by what he was witnessing that he had not stopped to think it through logically at all. Just grabbed onto me as hard as he could and pulled me bodily out of that house, dragging me through however many rooms and doorways stood between us and the outside, not stopping until we were both safely standing under that streetlight out front. We are still friends today, all these years later, and every so often the topic of that house still comes up between us, usually late at night during some longer conversation, when the subject naturally drifts toward strange or unexplainable things that have happened to either of us over the years. We have both moved on with our separate lives since high school, different cities, different careers. The kind of ordinary distance that naturally grows between old friends over time, but whenever we do manage to get together, whether it is a holiday visit or some rare weekend trip to see each other, that story almost always finds its way into the conversation, eventually, as though neither of us can quite go too long without revisiting it together. The story itself has never changed in all the times we have told it to each other since that night. Not one single detail shifting or softening the way stories sometimes do, the more often they get retold. It still sends a chill down my spine every single time, hearing him describe that black shape crawling out from under the table, picturing myself sitting there, completely unaware, groping blindly at nothing while something sat directly on top of me. To this day, I have never felt anything even close to that particular blackness or that particular coldness in my entire life, before or since. It was not just an absence of light or an absence of warmth, the way you might describe an ordinary dark room or a cold winter evening. It felt palpable somehow, almost sticky, like something with an actual physical presence and texture, rather than simply the absence of the things I would normally expect to be there. I have tried many times over the years to properly describe that sensation to other people, and I have never once managed to find words that fully capture just how wrong it felt, how completely unlike anything ordinary. The closest I have ever come is telling people to imagine stepping into a walk-in freezer at the exact moment someone flips off every light in the building at once, except somehow worse, somehow more deliberate, as though the cold and the darkness both had some kind of intent behind them, rather than simply being the absence of warmth and light. For a couple of days afterward, I could not shake this deep, unsettling feeling that clung to me, no matter what I did to try to distract myself from it. A lingering unease that followed me through school, through meals with my family, through every ordinary activity I tried to use to push the memory of that night out of my mind. My mom asked me more than once during those first couple of days whether something was bothering me, noticing that I seemed distracted and jumpier than usual, and I remember brushing her off with some vague excuse about not sleeping well, unable to bring myself to actually explain what had really happened without sounding completely insane. and I could never bring myself to walk past that house again. Not directly in front of it. Not even on the opposite side of the street if I could possibly help it. Always finding some alternate route that let me avoid that particular stretch of road entirely whenever I could manage it. Even years later, long after I had moved away from that neighborhood and built a completely different life somewhere else, I still think about that night more often than I would like to admit. Especially whenever December rolls back around and the air outside starts carrying that same particular cold I remember from that evening. There is something about that specific kind of winter chill, sharp and dry and just beginning to bite at your fingers, that pulls the memory right back up to the surface, no matter how many years separate me from it. No matter how far away I have moved from that old neighborhood and that particular street. My friend has told me he feels the same way, that certain smells or certain qualities of winter light still occasionally pull him straight back to that kitchen floor, to the sound of his own scream, to the sight of whatever that black shape actually was sitting there on top of me while I stared blankly ahead, seeing nothing at all. Neither of us has ever come up with any kind of satisfying explanation for what actually happened in that house that night, and honestly, at this point, I am not sure either of us actually wants one. We have batted around a few half-hearted theories over the years, the way you do with any story that never gets a real resolution, wondering aloud whether the house had some history neither of us had ever learned about. Some previous tragedy that might explain both the strange black shape and the constant restless turnover of owners who never seemed to stay longer than half a year. Neither of us has ever actually looked into the property records or the local history to find out for certain. And I think, deep down, we have both quietly agreed that we would rather not know for sure. Some things, I have come to believe, are better left as unanswered questions rather than mysteries you keep chasing for an explanation that might never come. And that house, whatever it actually was, or whatever had been living inside it during all those months it kept cycling through owners who never stayed longer than half a year, is one story I have simply learned to let sit exactly where it is, unresolved, in the back of my mind, rather than dig any further into trying to understand it properly. My grandmother swore by this story right up until her dying day, never once wavering on a single detail, no matter how many times she told it over the many long years, and it eventually became one of those cherished family stories that got repeated so very often at gatherings that even the youngest cousins, who never met her, could probably recite it themselves by heart. She would tell it at Christmas dinners, at family reunions, sometimes completely unprompted when the conversation drifted anywhere near the topic of the war, always with the same steady, measured tone, never rushed, never embellished beyond what she had told us the last time. The exact same pauses falling in the exact same places, no matter how many years passed between one telling and the next. It happened during the war, back when London was being bombed regularly and ordinary families were living through a level of fear and uncertainty that is genuinely hard for me to fully picture now, decades removed from any of it. Sirens and shelters and blacked-out windows having become an unfortunate part of everyday life for nearly everyone she knew. At the time, my dad was still just a tiny baby, barely old enough to be sitting up on his own, completely unaware of the chaos happening in the world around him, the way babies mercifully are. My grandmother's own house had been bombed out at some point before this particular night, leaving her without a proper home of her own. And she had ended up staying temporarily with a close friend while she worked out what to do next, the way so very many people in London were forced to lean on friends and family during that difficult period, doubling and even tripling up in whatever housing still remained standing after so much of the city had already been reduced to rubble. She rarely talked much about the loss of her own house whenever she told this story, mentioning it only briefly as background before moving on to the main event, though I have always suspected that losing her home so suddenly along with whatever belongings she was unable to save from it, must have left her in a state of heightened alertness and anxiety that stayed with her for the rest of that difficult period of the war. An anxiety that, looking back now, may well have sharpened her senses enough to notice something the rest of us might have simply missed entirely. Her friend had been kind enough to take her in without hesitation, setting her up in a room on the top floor of the house, giving her and my infant father a proper space of their own, rather than making them squeeze into some shared corner of the house downstairs, an act of generosity my grandmother never once forgot or failed to mention with real, heartfelt gratitude whenever the story came up again in later years. On the particular night this happened, my grandmother was doing exactly what she did every other night during her stay there, carrying my dad upstairs to put him down to sleep in that top floor room they had been given. It was, by her own account, an entirely unremarkable evening leading up to that moment. Dinner finished, the house settling into its usual nighttime quiet, nothing at all to suggest that this particular walk up the stairs would be any different from every other night she had made that same short journey since moving in, carrying my father up in her arms exactly the way she had done many, many dozens of times before, without a single incident. She told the story so many times over the years that certain small details of it stayed exactly the same no matter how many decades passed between tellings, and one detail she always included was how ordinary that walk up the stairs felt right up until it suddenly was not ordinary at all anymore. Partway up those stairs, a figure materialized directly in front of her, appearing there on the staircase in a way she always struggled to properly put into words, no matter how many times she tried to describe it to us afterward. She used to pause at exactly this point in the story every single time she told it, gathering herself for a moment before continuing, as though even after all those decades, the memory of that specific instant still carried some real weight for her. Her hands sometimes going still in her lap the way they never did at any other point in the telling. She never claimed to fully understand or explain how exactly this figure appeared, whether it stepped out from some shadow she had simply failed to notice, or whether it simply was not there one moment and then was there the next. But however it happened, she was suddenly faced with this presence blocking her path partway up the staircase. My infant father still held securely in her arms. The figure spoke to her, delivering a single clear message that she always repeated word for word whenever she told the story, telling her firmly not to sleep in that room tonight. The voice, by her account, calm and certain, in a way that left no room in her own mind for doubt or argument. She never described the figure in great physical detail whenever she told the story to any of us. And I sometimes wondered, growing up hearing this told and retold, whether that vagueness was intentional on her part, or whether the actual visual details of what she had seen had simply faded from her memory over the many years between that night and whenever she happened to be telling the story to us. What she was always completely clear and unwavering about, however, was the message itself, and the absolute certainty in her own mind that she needed to listen to it without question. She did not hesitate, and she did not stop to reason her way through what she had just experienced or try to rationalize it into something more ordinary. She simply turned around immediately and went right back down those stairs, my dad still held tightly against her, moving as quickly and decisively as she could manage while carrying an infant down a staircase in the dark. Her own heart pounding the whole way, even though she could not have explained exactly why she was so certain about what she needed to do in that moment, some deep instinct simply refusing to allow her feet to carry her back up toward that room a second time. Whatever fear or genuine confusion she felt in that moment, and she always freely admitted there was plenty of both. It was completely and totally overridden by an even stronger sense that she absolutely needed to get out of that room and away from those stairs immediately. Once she reached the bottom of the stairs, she went straight to find her friend, who was still awake somewhere downstairs, and told her, without offering much in the way of explanation, beyond the bare minimum, that she and my dad would not be sleeping in that top floor room that night after all. She always admitted, whenever she told this part, that she must have sounded a little wild-eyed and frantic in that moment, still shaken from what had just happened on the stairs, and not yet composed enough to explain herself calmly. Instead, she said, the two of them would be sleeping down in the sitting room, and that was simply how it was going to be for that particular night, regardless of whatever arrangements had already been made or however much extra trouble it might cause for anyone else in the house. Her friend, understandably, was not thrilled about this sudden change of plans. From my grandmother's perspective, it must have seemed like an absolutely obvious and necessary decision given what had just happened to her on those stairs. But from her friend's point of view, all she was actually seeing was a house guest suddenly announcing a change of sleeping arrangements in the middle of the night, with very little explanation offered as to why. It was wartime, after all, and everyone was already exhausted and on edge, sleep itself a precious and hard-fought commodity that nobody particularly wanted disrupted without a very good reason attached to it, especially not in the small hours of a night that had already felt long enough before any of this even began. Her friend pushed back a little, clearly annoyed at having her evening disrupted and her carefully arranged sleeping situation upended without much warning, but my grandmother apparently held firm, refusing to budge on the matter no matter how much her friend protested or questioned the reasoning behind it. Eventually, worn down by my grandmother's absolute insistence, her friend gave in and agreed to let them set up in the sitting room instead, still visibly annoyed about the whole situation, but not willing to argue about it any further that late into the night. My grandmother and my father spent that entire night sleeping down in the sitting room instead of the top floor bedroom they had originally been assigned. My grandmother lying awake for a long while afterward, despite the late hour, her mind still turning over everything that had just happened, unable to fully settle even once she was safely downstairs with her son beside her. It was there, sometime during those dark early morning hours, that a bomb exploded somewhere near the house. The blast was close enough and powerful enough that it caused significant damage to the building itself, rattling the windows and sending dust sifting down from the ceiling, even in the sitting room where they had ended up, and the roof over that top-floor bedroom, the very room my grandmother and my infant father would have been sleeping in that night had she not turned back on those stairs, caved in completely under the force of the explosion. She always told this part of the story with a particular weight to her voice, one that never seemed to fade no matter how many times over the decades she repeated it, her pace always slowing noticeably as she reached this particular point in the telling, as though, even after so many retellings, the memory still demanded a certain kind of respect from her before she could continue on. The section of roof that came down landed directly on top of the cot. The very same cot my father would have been sleeping in that night if she had continued up those stairs and put him down to bed the way she had originally intended to, before that figure appeared in front of her. There was no ambiguity in her mind whatsoever, none at all, about what would have happened to her infant son if she had simply carried on with her evening exactly as planned. He would have been killed, crushed under that collapsing roof along with the cot he would have been lying in, and my grandmother would have lost her only child on a night that, without that single strange, unexplainable interruption on the staircase, would have played out in exactly that tragic way. Her friend, once the immediate danger had passed and the two of them, along with the rest of the household, had properly processed just how close a call it had actually been, never questioned my grandmother's decision that night again. Not for one moment. Whatever annoyance she had felt earlier in the evening about the sudden change of sleeping arrangements evaporated completely once she saw with her own eyes exactly what had happened to that top-floor room, and exactly what would have happened to a sleeping infant if he had still been lying in that cot when the roof finally gave way under the force of that bomb. My grandmother always said that her friend went very quiet after seeing the damage, standing there in the doorway just staring up at the collapsed ceiling for a long moment, before finally turning to her without a single word of complaint left in her. Only relief, and a kind of stunned gratitude that neither of them fully knew how to put into words that night. My grandmother carried the memory of that figure on the stairs with her for the rest of her life, and she genuinely believed, right up until her dying day, that whatever or whoever it truly was had saved my father's life that night. And by extension, given that he grew up to eventually have children of his own, had made possible the existence of an entire branch of our family that would never have existed at all had that bomb landed on a sleeping infant instead of an empty, already collapsed bedroom. She used to say at the very end of telling the story every single time that she never did learn who or what that figure actually was, and that in all her years afterward she never once encountered anything similar again. No other strange visitors, no other unexplained warnings. As though whatever it had been existed for that single purpose alone on that single night, and then simply vanished from her life entirely once its job was done. She was never a particularly superstitious woman in most other respects, from everything my own parents and older relatives have told me about her over the years. She approached most of her life with a fairly practical, grounded outlook. Not the kind of person who normally put much stock in ghost stories or unexplained phenomena of any kind, and she was known throughout the family for being sensible almost to a fault. The sort of person who quietly rolled her eyes whenever some other relative got carried away telling a far less credible tale over the dinner table. But on this one specific point, regarding that figure on the stairs and the warning it gave her, she never once wavered, never allowed anyone in the family to talk her into some more rational explanation. No matter how gently or persistently certain skeptical relatives occasionally tried to suggest one over the years. My own uncle in particular, who spent a good portion of his adult life gently pushing for some scientific explanation she simply refused to accept. I remember asking her about it myself when I was old enough to properly understand the story, curious whether she had ever considered some more ordinary explanation, some trick of exhaustion or stress, given everything she had already been through by that point in the war, having already lost her own home to a previous bombing before this incident even happened. I asked her this more than once over the years, at different ages, sometimes half hoping for a slightly different answer than the one I already knew was coming, curious whether time might have softened her certainty even a little. She always listened patiently to that kind of question, never getting defensive or annoyed about being asked to explain herself, but her answer never changed no matter how the question was phrased. She told me she knew, with an absolute certainty that never once faded over the following decades, exactly what she had seen and heard on that staircase, and that no amount of wartime exhaustion or stress could possibly account for a message that specific, that clear, and that perfectly, tragically timed. The story has been passed down through our family ever since, told and retold at gatherings, at holidays, whenever the subject of the war or of my grandmother's own remarkable life happened to come up in conversation. My own children have heard it now, too, sitting wide-eyed at the dinner table the same way I once did, asking the exact same questions I asked at their age, wanting to know what the figure looked like, whether it spoke in a normal voice or something stranger. whether my grandmother was ever frightened of it afterward, or whether she came to think of it, in some strange way, as something closer to a guardian than a threat. Even now, with my grandmother long since passed away herself, the story still gets told almost exactly the way she always told it, with that same careful attention to detail, that same weight given to the moment the figure appeared on the stairs, and the moment, sometime in those dark early morning hours afterward, when the roof came down exactly where my father would have been sleeping. I think about that story more often than I probably should, especially now that I have children of my own and understand a little better, in a way I could not have as a child myself, exactly what it must have felt like for my grandmother in that moment, carrying her infant son in her arms, faced with something on those stairs she could never properly explain, and choosing, without a single moment of real hesitation, despite everything, to trust it completely. There have been nights with my own children, standing at the top of our own staircase, carrying one of them up to bed, when that story has crossed my mind unbidden. A small, strange echo of hers passing through me before I shake it off and continue on with the ordinary business of an ordinary evening. Whatever that figure actually was, whatever explanation might exist for what happened on that staircase all those years ago, I know that without it, I very likely would not exist at all. And neither would any of the rest of my father's children or grandchildren who came after him. That thought alone is enough to make the whole story feel far more significant to me than any ordinary ghost story ever could, no matter how many times I have already heard it told. My grandma was only around 7 years old at the time, living in Germany during the Second World War, in a small town that was getting bombed on a fairly regular basis by that point in the conflict. She used to say that by the time this particular story happened, the sound of planes overhead had already become something the whole family had learned to live with. A background hum of dread that never quite went away no matter how many nights passed without incident. The kind of constant low-level fear that eventually becomes almost normal, simply because there is no other choice but to keep living alongside it, day after day, for as long as the war itself dragged on. Life during those years had settled into a strange, uneasy routine for her family and for everyone else living in that town. A constant undercurrent of fear that never fully went away, punctuated by the occasional night when that fear became suddenly and terrifyingly real as bombers passed overhead and the whole town braced itself for whatever damage the night might bring. My grandma rarely talked about those years in great detail when she was older, but this particular story was one she did share more than once, always with the same quiet, careful tone she reserved for the handful of memories from that period that had stayed sharp and clear in her mind despite everything else that had faded with time. Her family lived in an ordinary house in that town. Nothing especially remarkable about it beyond the fact that it was simply home. The place where she had grown up alongside her younger brother, the two of them close in the particular way siblings often are when they have shared an entire childhood together under difficult circumstances. It was a modest house, the kind that filled most streets in towns like theirs across the country at the time, with a small garden out back, where her mother sometimes managed to grow a few vegetables despite everything going on around them, and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of whatever bread had most recently been baked there. One of the small, ordinary comforts that somehow persisted even through the very worst years of the war. Her little brother was younger than her, still small enough to be easily frightened by the kind of things that frighten small children everywhere, though living through a war certainly gave him far more legitimate reasons to be afraid than most children his age would ever have to contend with in ordinary times. One particular day, for reasons my grandma was never entirely able to explain even decades later, her little brother became fixated on the idea of staying overnight at their neighbor's house instead of sleeping at home the way they normally would. There was nothing unusual about the day leading up to it. From what my grandma could remember many years later, no argument at breakfast, no frightening incident earlier that particular afternoon that might have obviously explained why he suddenly latched on to this one idea with such surprising intensity. He started crying about it at some point during the day, insisting over and over that he wanted to stay with the neighbors that night, refusing to let the subject drop no matter how their parents initially tried to reason with him or distract him with something else. My grandma always described him as being unusually persistent about it that particular day, more so than his usual childhood requests, crying and begging in a way that eventually wore their parents down rather than fading on its own the way most small tantrums or fixations usually did within an hour or two. Their parents, faced with a small child who simply would not let the idea go, no matter what they tried, eventually agreed to let him have his way, worn down as much by their own exhaustion after a long day as by his relentless insistence. And since my grandma was young enough herself that separating the siblings for the night did not seem like a particularly good idea, the whole family ended up making the short walk over to the neighbor's house together to arrange staying there for the night. The neighbors, from what my grandma remembered, were perfectly happy to have them. The kind of close, familiar relationship that often developed between families living right next door to each other during a period when everyone was leaning on each other more than usual just to get through each difficult stretch of the war. That night, after they had all settled into the neighbor's house, a bombing run came through their town. Planes passing overhead in the darkness the way they had many times before during those years, dropping their payload across different parts of the town below. My grandma remembered the family sitting together in whatever room the neighbors had set aside for them that night, listening to the distant drone of engines growing steadily closer overhead. That particular sound, she said, she never fully stopped associating with dread even decades later, long after the war itself had become nothing more than history in a textbook for the rest of the world, taught nowadays to school children who could never truly understand what it had actually felt like to lie there, listening, in the dark. My grandma always described that night as being particularly bad compared to some of the other bombing runs they had lived through, loud enough and close enough that even from inside the relative safety of the neighbor's house, the whole family could feel the ground shaking beneath them with each impact somewhere out in the darkness. When the bombing finally stopped and the immediate danger had passed, and once it felt safe enough to actually go outside and see what damage had been done to the town overnight, my grandma's family made their way back toward their own house to check on it, the way everyone in the neighborhood was doing that morning, walking out into streets filled with dust and debris and the particular kind of eerie quiet that always seemed to follow a bad night like that one. She described the walk back as feeling almost unbearably long. Even though the distance itself was quite short, every single step bringing them closer to an answer none of them were entirely prepared for, the adults in the group growing quieter and quieter the closer they got to where their street should have been. What they found, once they finally reached the spot where their house had stood only the evening before, was nothing but rubble, an unrecognizable mess of broken stone and dust where a home full of memories had stood just hours earlier. Their house had taken a direct hit during that particular bombing run and had been completely destroyed, reduced entirely to a pile of broken brick and splintered wood where their entire home had stood only hours earlier, nothing left standing that anyone in the family could immediately recognize as having once been the place they called home. Had her little brother not thrown that particular fit earlier that day, had he not cried and begged and stubbornly refused to let the idea of staying at the neighbor's house drop the way he so often did with far less consequential requests, the entire family would have almost certainly been sleeping in that very house exactly when the bomb hit it directly, with little to no chance of surviving the collapse that followed. My grandma understood, even as a young child standing there, looking at the rubble that used to be her home, and even more clearly as she grew older and properly processed the full weight of what had actually happened that night, that her brother's strange, insistent crying had almost certainly saved every single one of their lives. She used to say that standing there that particular morning, still much too young to fully grasp the enormity of it all in the moment itself, some small part of her already sensed that something deeply significant had just happened, even if the full understanding of exactly how significant would only really settle in years and years later. Once she was finally old enough to properly comprehend what a direct hit on an occupied house during a bombing run would have actually meant for absolutely everyone inside it. She never fully understood, and as far as I know, neither did her brother himself once he grew old enough to really think it over, exactly why he had become so fixated on staying at the neighbor's house that particular day. Out of all the ordinary days that came before and after it during those difficult years. My grandma used to say she wished more than once over the many years that followed that she had thought to ask their parents about it properly while they were still alive and able to answer, whether they had ever noticed anything unusual in his behavior in the days or weeks leading up to that specific, insistent request. But by the time she was finally old enough to think to ask that question properly, both of her parents had already passed away, taking whatever additional insight they might have had along with them into the grave. It was not something he had ever asked for before that day, and according to my grandma, he did not particularly ask for it again in quite the same insistent way afterward either, as though whatever had driven that specific request on that specific day had simply been a singular, unrepeated event in an otherwise ordinary childhood spent living through an extraordinarily difficult period of history. My grandma carried the memory of that night with her for the rest of her life, and she would tell the story every so often when the subject of the war came up in conversation, usually with a certain quiet disbelief still evident in her voice even so many decades removed from the actual event itself. She never told it as a dramatic or frightening story exactly, not the way you might tell a proper ghost story meant to give someone a scare, but rather with a kind of solemn, quiet wonder, as though she herself was still occasionally struck by the sheer improbability of it all, even after having lived with the knowledge for the better part of her entire long life. She would describe standing there as a small child, looking at what remained of the house she had grown up in, trying to properly comprehend that if her little brother had not cried and begged the way he did, she would very likely not have survived that particular night at all, along with the rest of her immediate family. The neighbors who took them in that night, whose names I unfortunately never learned since my grandma rarely mentioned them by name when telling the story, ended up playing an unknowing but absolutely crucial role in her family's survival, simply by being willing, without much fuss or hesitation, to let a crying 7-year-old and his family stay over for one single night. I have often wondered myself what became of that family in the years that followed, whether they ever fully understood the important role they had unknowingly played in keeping an entire other family alive, or whether it simply remained, for them, one small, unremarkable act of neighborly kindness among countless others during a very difficult period. Never singled out in their own memory the way it clearly was in my grandma's memory for the rest of her long life. My grandma always spoke of them with real gratitude whenever this story came up, even though, as far as she knew, none of them ever fully grasped just how significant that one ordinary act of neighborly kindness had actually turned out to be. Growing up hearing this story myself, I always found it remarkable how something as seemingly small and ordinary as a young child's persistent crying, the kind of thing parents everywhere deal with constantly, and usually without much lasting consequence, ended up being the single deciding factor between my grandma's entire family surviving that war or not surviving it. It is the kind of thing that, told as fiction, might seem almost too neat or too convenient to be believable, and yet my grandma insisted, every single time she told it, that this was exactly how it happened, with no embellishment needed to make the story feel significant, the facts alone carrying more than enough weight on their own. There was no elaborate warning involved, no strange figure appearing out of nowhere to deliver some clear and unmistakable message. Just a small boy's inexplicable insistence on sleeping somewhere other than his own bed that particular night. An insistence that, for reasons nobody in the family has ever been able to properly explain, turned out to be exactly the thing that kept all of them alive. My grandma often said, whenever she reached the end of telling this particular story, that she had spent years afterward wondering what exactly had caused her brother to become so fixated on that one specific night, whether some part of him had somehow sensed danger the rest of the family could not, or whether it truly had just been one of those inexplicable childhood fixations that occasionally happened for no discernible reason at all, and simply happened, through nothing more than pure chance, to save all their lives on that particular occasion. She told me once, during one of the last long conversations we ever had together, that she used to lie awake as an older woman, long after the war and long after her own children were grown and had children of their own, still turning that same question over and over again in her mind without ever landing anywhere near a satisfying conclusion. The mystery of it apparently just as alive for her decades later as it had been on the very morning she first stood looking at that pile of rubble. She never landed firmly on one explanation over the other. Content, by the time she was telling the story as an older woman, to simply hold the mystery of it rather than needing to resolve it definitively, one way or the other. The house itself was eventually rebuilt after the war ended. Like so many other homes across that same town and across the wider country, life slowly returning to some semblance of normal, even as the physical and emotional scars of those years remained visible for a long time afterward, in ways both large and small. My grandma described the years right after the war as strange and slow. Everyone around her rebuilding not just their homes, but their entire sense of what an ordinary day was even supposed to look like anymore. Learning gradually to stop flinching at the sound of engines passing overhead. Learning to trust, however cautiously and however slowly, that the worst of it had actually finally passed for good. My grandma continued living in that same general area for a good portion of her early life after the war concluded, walking past the rebuilt house and the surrounding streets many times over the following years. The memory of that particular bombing run and her family's narrow, unlikely escape from it never fully leaving her mind, no matter how much time passed or how ordinary her daily life eventually became again. Her brother grew up alongside her, the two of them remaining close for the rest of their lives, and my grandma told me that whenever the subject of that night came up between the two of them privately, away from the rest of the family, he always seemed a little uncomfortable discussing it in any real depth, never quite able to explain his own behavior that day any better than she could from the outside looking in. She said he would usually try to change the subject fairly quickly whenever it came up between just the two of them alone, deflecting with some small joke or simply steering the conversation off elsewhere entirely, in a way that felt noticeably different from how easily and openly he could talk about almost every other memory from that same difficult period of their shared childhood. I think, in some strange way, the not knowing bothered him more than it ever seemed to bother her, as though carrying the knowledge that his own inexplicable childhood insistence had somehow saved his entire family's lives was a weight he never fully learned how to comfortably carry, even well into his own old age. I think about this story often myself now, particularly whenever I consider how many small, seemingly insignificant decisions and moments end up shaping entire lives and entire family histories in ways nobody could possibly predict or plan for in advance. It makes me wonder, sometimes, about all the other small, unremarkable moments that must have quietly shaped the survival or the loss of countless other families during that very same war. Moments nobody happened to be paying close enough attention to at the time to ever properly remember or pass down to later generations afterward, unlike my grandma's own family, who happened to have one small boy whose stubborn insistence turned out, against every ordinary expectation anyone might have had, to matter more than anyone could have possibly known in that moment. A small boy crying about where he wanted to sleep for one single night. An ordinary enough occurrence that could have happened in any family during any period of history. Ended up being the exact thread that kept my grandma's entire family alive long enough for her to eventually grow up, have children of her own, and pass this remarkable story down through the generations that followed her. Myself very much included among them. My mother told me this story not too long ago, though the actual events themselves happened about 10 full years before she finally shared it with me, which in itself always struck me as a little strange, that something this significant had sat quietly within the family for so long before I ever heard a word about it. I remember the exact conversation where she first brought it up. Both of us sitting quietly in her kitchen on some otherwise unremarkable evening, the topic drifting there almost entirely by accident after some other unrelated conversation about family history had wandered its way slowly toward memories of my cousin. When my cousin was around 17 or 18 years old, she was involved in a car crash, one serious enough that she ended up in the hospital for a couple of weeks afterward, before eventually passing away from her injuries. It was a devastating loss for the entire extended family. The kind of sudden, senseless tragedy that reshapes how everyone around it thinks about life for a long time afterward, especially given how genuinely young she still was when it happened, with so much of her whole life still ahead of her that never got the chance to properly unfold the way it should have. My cousin had always been particularly close with my dad's sister, our aunt, in a way that went well beyond the ordinary closeness you might expect between an aunt and a niece. They had that kind of easy, comfortable relationship, where age did not seem to matter very much at all between them, where my cousin genuinely enjoyed spending her free time at our aunt's house rather than simply tolerating family obligations the way some teenagers often might. And our aunt, in turn, treated her almost like an older daughter of her own, rather than simply a niece who happened to live nearby in the same town. She used to babysit our aunt's young children regularly and often. Kids who at the time were no older than about 4 years old, young enough that they still required constant, attentive care throughout each and every day, and my cousin had apparently become something of a fixture in that household, spending enough time there that she was practically considered part of the immediate family rather than simply an occasional visiting relative. Our aunt trusted her completely with those young children, which says a great deal about the kind of relationship they had built over those years. A level of trust that does not come easily or automatically within any family, even a close one. At the time all of this happened, our aunt's house had been in the middle of a fairly significant construction project, some kind of renovation or addition being built onto the existing structure, and that construction work had already been underway well before my cousin's accident occurred, meaning the workers involved had been coming and going from that property for some time already by the point any of this strange business started happening. Rather than pausing entirely in the aftermath of such a devastating loss, the construction continued on in the weeks and months that followed, life and practical necessities carrying on in that particular mundane way they often do, even in the middle of profound grief. The workers showing up each day to continue their assigned tasks, regardless of what the family inside that house was, privately, going through behind closed doors. One day, sometime after my cousin had passed away, our aunt received a phone call while she was at work, coming from one of the construction workers who had been working on the house for weeks by that point and had gotten fairly familiar with the property and its usual comings and goings. He called specifically to complain about a teenage girl who apparently kept showing up at the property, walking around the site in a way that was clearly starting to bother him, and presumably some of the other workers as well, enough that he felt compelled to actually pick up the phone rather than simply letting it go unmentioned. According to what he told our aunt, this had not been a single, one-time occurrence either. This particular girl had shown up multiple times over the course of a couple of weeks, appearing and walking around the site with enough regularity that the workers had started to notice a genuine pattern to it. Enough of one that he felt it was worth actually calling the homeowner directly to mention it and ask whether she knew who this girl might be. Our aunt, understandably curious and a little confused about who this mystery teenager wandering around her property might actually be, asked the worker to give her a description, thinking that it might simply be some local kid from the neighborhood who had developed an odd habit of cutting through the construction site or hanging around out of simple curiosity, the way teenagers sometimes do, around any interesting disruption to their usual surroundings, curious about the machinery or the noise, or simply looking for somewhere new to spend an idle afternoon. The worker gave her a fairly detailed description in response, mentioning long brown hair, a red baseball cap, denim dungarees, and a white jacket, describing this girl's typical appearance in enough specific detail that our aunt would presumably be able to recognize her if she did in fact know her from somewhere in the local area. The description matched my cousin perfectly. Every single detail the worker gave, right down to the specific combination of clothing, lined up exactly with how my cousin had typically dressed and looked in the weeks and months leading right up to her accident. The same long brown hair she had always been known for, the same red baseball cap she wore constantly enough that it had practically become associated with her personally. Among everyone who knew her well, the same denim dungarees and white jacket that had practically become something of a signature look for her among everyone in the family who knew her well. Our aunt, hearing this description over the phone, must have felt an immediate and deeply unsettling jolt of recognition, though from what my mother told me, she did not say anything to the worker in that moment beyond thanking him for letting her know and telling him she would look into it, keeping her own reaction carefully composed despite whatever must have been racing through her mind at that exact second. When our aunt got home from work that day, she pulled up a photograph of my cousin, one that clearly showed her wearing that same distinctive outfit she had so often been seen in, and she brought it out to show the construction workers who were still there finishing up their work for the day, walking up to them directly, rather than waiting to bring the matter up at some later, more convenient time. She asked them directly whether this was the girl they had been seeing walking around the property over the past couple of weeks. Every single one of the workers who looked at that photograph agreed, without hesitation and without any prompting from our aunt, that yes, this was absolutely the same girl they had all seen wandering around the construction site multiple times over recent weeks, several of them nodding immediately and confirming it independently of one another before she had even finished asking the full question. None of those construction workers, as far as anyone in the family has ever been able to determine, had any prior knowledge whatsoever about my cousin, about her accident, or about the fact that she had recently passed away. There was simply no reasonable way for any of them to have known any of these details in advance. No shared connections, no local gossip that might have somehow reached them, nothing at all that could easily explain how they might have gotten such a specific description right by pure coincidence. They were simply outside contractors hired to complete a renovation project, With no personal connection to our family beyond the professional one required to do their job, and no obvious reason at all to have known anything about a recently deceased teenage relative of the homeowner, unless they had, in fact, genuinely seen her walking around that property exactly as they described. When my mother first told me this story, it genuinely unsettled me in a way that very few things ever have, largely because of the particular family context surrounding it. Our family has never been the type to put much stock in anything paranormal, and nothing remotely like this had ever happened to any of us before, or as far as I know, has happened to any of us since either. Growing up, I cannot recall a single instance of anyone in our extended family ever telling a ghost story with any real conviction behind it, or claiming to have experienced anything remotely unexplainable, which made this particular account stand out all the more sharply against that otherwise entirely ordinary family backdrop. We are not a family prone to embellishing stories for dramatic effect, and my mother in particular has always been one of the most level-headed, practical people I know. Not someone who exaggerates or invents things simply for the sake of a good story. Hearing this account come from her specifically, told in that same calm, matter-of-fact tone she uses for almost everything else in life, made the whole thing feel far more credible and far more unsettling than if I had heard the exact same story secondhand from someone with less direct credibility within the family. I have thought about this story many times since my mother first told it to me, turning over the same few unanswerable questions in my mind that I imagine everyone else in the family has also turned over at some point since first hearing it. Why would my cousin, if it truly was her presence that those workers kept seeing, choose specifically to return to our aunt's house of all places? Walking around a half-finished construction site rather than anywhere else that might have held more obvious significance to her during her life, her own childhood home, or somewhere else meaningful to her that never came up as a location worth mentioning. My best guess, and it is only a guess, is that the closeness between her and our aunt, and especially the deep bond she had formed with those young children she used to babysit so often, might have drawn her back there specifically. Some lingering attachment to that particular house, and the family living inside it strong enough to bring her back again and again over those first couple of weeks after her passing. Our aunt has never spoken much about how she personally felt in the aftermath of learning about all of this, at least not in any detail that has been shared with me, though my mother mentioned that she seemed genuinely shaken by it at the time. Understandably so, given everything she had already been through with losing my cousin so suddenly and so young. On top of everything else that comes with grieving someone so close to your own children. I imagine there must have been some strange, complicated mixture of grief and comfort wrapped up together in learning that her niece might, in some form, still be returning to a place that had clearly meant a great deal to her, even if the circumstances surrounding that return were undeniably unsettling to actually process. A feeling I doubt I could ever fully understand unless I experienced something similar myself. The construction on the house was eventually completed, the workers finishing their project and moving on to whatever other jobs came next for them, presumably carrying this particular story with them as a strange, unexplained anecdote from one job among presumably many others over the course of their careers. Something to tell their own families or coworkers whenever the subject of unusual work. Experiences happened to come up over the years that followed. As far as I know, nobody in the family has heard of or experienced anything similar happening at that house since the renovation was finished. No further sightings, no further reports from anyone else who might have spent time on that property in the years that followed. Whatever it was those workers saw walking around that construction site during those specific couple of weeks, it seems to have been limited entirely to that particular period, never repeating itself again in any way that anyone in the family has ever mentioned to me. I still find myself thinking about this story more often than I probably should, especially whenever the anniversary of my cousin's passing rolls back around each year, or whenever some unrelated conversation happens to drift toward the subject of the paranormal, or the unexplained more generally, whether at a family gathering or simply among friends swapping strange stories, the way people sometimes do late at night. Given how thoroughly unremarkable and grounded my family has always been about that particular kind of thing, the fact that this specific story exists at all, told to me by my own mother in her usual calm and reliable way, has left me with a lingering sense that something genuinely unexplainable really did happen at my aunt's house during those weeks, whatever that something actually was. I have found myself, more than once, looking up old photographs of my cousin just to look again at that same white jacket and red baseball cap the workers described so precisely, trying to picture her walking calmly around that half-built structure, and each time I do, I am left with the same unresolved mixture of comfort and unease that I imagine everyone else in my family has quietly carried with them ever since first hearing this story themselves. My cousin's parents, my own aunt and uncle on that side of the family, have their own complicated relationship with this particular story, from what I understand secondhand through my mother. They were, understandably, devastated by the original loss in a way that never fully leaves any parent who has had to bury their own child far too soon. And hearing that their own daughter might have been seen wandering around a relative's property in the weeks immediately following her death brought up an entirely new and complicated layer of emotion for both of them to process on top of everything else they were already carrying at the time. I know that my mother has always been careful about how and when she brings this particular story up around them directly, well aware that even a story that offers some strange form of comfort can also reopen wounds that have never fully healed in the first place. And I have followed her lead in that same careful, respectful approach whenever the subject has come up naturally in conversations of my own with other relatives over the years. My uncle, from what I understand, has always leaned toward wanting some kind of rational, logical explanation for what those workers reported seeing that day, unable to fully sit comfortably with the idea that it might genuinely have been his own daughter walking around that property, even though he has never openly disputed or argued against the details of the story itself whenever it happens to come up in family conversation. My aunt, on the other hand, has apparently found a strange sort of peace in it over the many years since, telling my mother once that she preferred to believe her daughter really had come back to visit, even briefly, rather than dismiss the whole account as some elaborate coincidence or a simple case of mistaken identity involving some other local teenager who happened to dress in a remarkably similar way to how my cousin always had. There is something particularly striking to me about the specificity of the description those workers gave. The fact that it was not some vague, generalized account of a teenage girl in dark clothing or an indistinct figure glimpsed briefly from a distance, but rather a precise, detailed rundown of an outfit that genuinely matched, item for item, exactly what my cousin had been known to wear. Long brown hair alone might easily be dismissed as pure coincidence, matching countless other teenage girls living in that local area at the time. But long brown hair combined with a red baseball cap, denim dungarees, and a white jacket, all worn together in that exact same combination, narrows the possibilities down considerably, especially given that none of those workers had any documented reason to know what my cousin had looked like before that phone call ever took place between our aunt and the worker who first brought the matter up. I sometimes wonder what those construction workers themselves made of the whole situation once they learned, presumably from our aunt, exactly who it was they claimed to have been seeing on that property for those couple of weeks. I have never had the opportunity to speak with any of them directly myself, and my mother has never mentioned whether they said anything further about it once the connection was confirmed, whether they felt frightened or simply unsettled, or perhaps something closer to a quiet, respectful acceptance of having witnessed something they could not fully explain, the kind of thing that stays with a person quietly for years without ever being fully resolved one way or the other. I imagine it must have been a strange thing for those workers to carry with them afterward, finishing out the remainder of that renovation project on a property they now understood, or at least strongly suspected, to have had some kind of lingering, unexplainable presence attached to it during those specific couple of weeks. During my high school years, one of my closest friends lived right beside a house that seemed permanently stuck with a for sale sign out front, year after year, no matter how much time passed. We had known each other practically our whole lives by that point, close enough that his house sometimes felt like more of a second home to me than my own, given how many afternoons and weekends I ended up spending there over the years. Whoever happened to be renting or owning it at any given moment would vanish overnight, disappearing without any warning or explanation. No farewell, no daytime moving truck, just an empty house appearing where a lived-in one had stood the evening before. For roughly 2 full years leading up to the night I am about to describe, that place had cycled through owner after owner, never once staying with the same family for longer than half a year at any single stretch. Even as teenagers, my friend and I found that particular pattern strange enough to comment on from time to time, though it took us a fairly long while before curiosity actually pushed either of us to do anything about it. One slow, uneventful evening, bored out of our minds the way only teenagers with absolutely nothing to do can truly be, my friend brought up the idea of sneaking into that empty house next door, since it had been sitting vacant and untouched for a good long stretch by that particular point. We had already run through every single other idea we could possibly think of for how to kill the rest of the night, each one falling completely flat after only a few minutes of half-hearted discussion. So by the time he mentioned the house, both of us were genuinely desperate enough for something different, that even a fairly reckless idea started to sound appealing that night. I remember laughing the suggestion off completely at first, treating it like one of those throwaway ideas that gets mentioned once in passing and then quietly forgotten a moment later. But boredom has a peculiar way of eroding good sense entirely, and within a fairly short while we had somehow talked ourselves all the way into actually going through with it. The two of us slipping quietly outside together once we had finally settled on the plan between us. We crept quietly around to the back of the house together, moving with an instinctive kind of caution, even though there was realistically nobody nearby to notice or care what we were actually doing that night. The yard back there had that particular overgrown, thoroughly neglected look empty houses always seemed to develop after a while, grass grown well past where it should have been kept. A couple of dead, brittle patches scattered here and there across the lawn where something had clearly stopped being watered months ago. Set into the back door of the house was a small dog door, quite clearly left behind by whichever previous owner had once kept a pet there, and my friend, being noticeably slighter and more flexible than me at the time, managed to wriggle through it without all that much trouble, muttering some quiet joke under his breath about how relieved he was that none of the neighbors happened to be glancing out their windows at that exact moment. From inside, he then reached over and unlocked the door properly so that I could step through the normal way rather than attempting that same tight squeeze myself. Once we were finally both standing inside together, the house struck me as thoroughly unremarkable, almost a little disappointingly so given all the build-up leading up to that moment. It looked to be a craftsman-style build from somewhere around the 1950s, situated in one of the older, more established parts of town. the kind of neighborhood filled with tall, mature trees and older homes that carried noticeably more genuine character than the newer subdivisions cropping up elsewhere on the outskirts of town. My friend's own house, right next door, had actually been constructed in a fairly similar style around that same general era, so stepping through this particular one felt oddly like walking through a distorted echo of a place I already knew fairly well already. The layout close enough to his own home that I could almost predict where each doorway would open up before we actually got there. The kitchen contained a lovely built-in breakfast nook set against a wide picture window, the sort of cozy little spot that had probably once been someone's favorite place to sit with a morning coffee, long before the house started churning through owners every few months, for reasons none of the neighbors ever seemed to figure out. There were still faint outlines on the nearby wall where picture frames must have once hung, small rectangular patches of slightly less faded paint marking, where family photographs had probably sat for years before whoever last lived there packed up everything and disappeared without a trace. With the electricity shut off entirely, the interior sat in near total darkness, though the glow from the streetlight outside filtered in through that picture window just enough to let us make out shapes without needing a flashlight. My friend and I dropped down onto the floor across from that table, sitting there in the faint streetlight glow, simply talking the way teenagers do when there is nowhere else they need to be, and no real purpose behind the conversation beyond enjoying each other's company. I could not tell you now what exactly we were talking about that night. Nothing about the conversation itself left any lasting impression, not compared to what came afterward. I genuinely have no idea how long we had been sitting there, comfortable and completely at ease, before everything changed in an instant. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe closer to 15, long enough that any lingering nervous excitement from breaking into the place had completely worn off, replaced by the ordinary, easy comfort of just hanging out with my best friend somewhere new. My friend suddenly screamed, and in that exact same moment, my entire vision went black. This was not an ordinary kind of darkness, not the sort your eyes gradually adjust to in an unlit room. It was total, immediate, and complete, as though something had simply reached in and switched my sight off entirely. A darkness so absolute it did not even carry the faint shifting shapes your eyes normally pick up even in a pitch-dark room. Alongside that abrupt blindness came a sickly, overwhelming cold that seemed to flood through my whole body at once, spreading from my scalp down to my toes far too quickly to be explained by anything ordinary. I started screaming, too, my body reacting on pure instinct to something my mind could not begin to process. Every part of me suddenly convinced, without any clear reason, that something was very wrong and getting worse by the second. Somewhere in the middle of all that noise, I felt my friend grab my hand, gripping tight and hauling me forcefully in some direction I could not see. My feet stumbling along after him, purely by feel, rather than any real sense of where we were actually headed. Slowly, my sight began returning, and along with it came warmth seeping back into my limbs, that horrible cold retreating the same way it had arrived, leaving behind a strange, hollow ache that took a good while longer to fully fade away. By the time I had mostly come back to myself, I realized we were standing outside under the streetlight. And strangely, the cold December night air felt noticeably warmer against my skin than whatever had just surrounded me inside that house, which struck me immediately as completely backwards given the time of year. I turned to look at my friend, and the expression on his face stopped me cold before I could even ask what had happened. He looked more frightened than I had ever seen him in all the years we had known each other, his whole body still tense, his eyes wide with something close to shock, his hands still gripping my arm tightly as though some part of him was not quite ready to let go and confirm we were actually safe. I was confused and shaken myself. My mind still trying to catch up with everything that had just happened, but I managed to ask him what exactly had gone on back there. He told me that while I had been talking away, seemingly oblivious, a black shape had emerged from beneath that breakfast table. He said he noticed it first as just the slightest shift in the darkness under the table. Something he almost brushed off as a trick of shadow or streetlight, right up until it kept moving, low and deliberate, crawling out from beneath the table and heading directly toward where I sat. He described it as entirely black, carrying only the barest suggestion of a girl's outline. Nothing more detailed than that. No face, no visible clothing, just that dark, featureless shape moving with unmistakable purpose, and said it had crawled directly toward me before climbing up and settling itself on top of me, while I apparently kept right on talking, seemingly unaware anything unusual was happening at all. He said I had started groping around blindly with my hands, my eyes wide open, but clearly seeing nothing, moving the way someone does when they have completely lost their sight and are desperately trying to feel their way toward something solid. Watching me do that, he said, calm and blank faced on the surface while my hands searched frantically at nothing, was somehow even more disturbing than the black shape itself had been. He had been so frightened by what he was witnessing that he had not paused to think it through, just grabbed me and physically pulled me out of the house, dragging me through whatever room stood between us and the back door. We are still close friends today, all these years later, and every now and then that story comes back up between us, usually during some late-night conversation when the subject drifts toward strange or unexplainable things. We have both scattered to different cities since high school, built entirely separate lives with different jobs and different daily routines. The kind of ordinary distance that naturally grows between old friends over time. But whenever we do manage to see each other, whether during a holiday visit home or some rare weekend trip, that particular story almost always finds its way back into conversation eventually, as though neither of us can quite go too long without revisiting it together. The story has never once changed in the retelling, not a single detail shifting no matter how many times we go over it. It still sends a chill through me every single time, picturing myself sitting there completely unaware while something sat on top of me. To this day, I have never experienced anything close to that particular blackness or that particular cold again. Not once. Not in any situation since. It was not simply an absence of light or warmth, the way you might describe an ordinary dark room or a chilly winter evening. It felt tangible somehow, almost sticky, like something with real physical presence rather than just the lack of what should have been there. I have tried to describe that sensation to other people many times over the years and have never quite found the right words for how wrong it felt, how completely unlike anything ordinary. The closest I have ever managed is telling people to imagine stepping into a walk-in freezer at the exact instant someone kills every light in the building at once, except somehow worse, somehow more deliberate, as though both the cold and the darkness carried some sort of intent behind them. For a couple of days afterward, I could not shake a deep, lingering unease that followed me everywhere. Through school, through meals at home, through every ordinary part of my day that I tried to use as a distraction. My mom asked more than once whether something was bothering me. Noticing I seemed jumpier and more distracted than usual, and I remember brushing her off with some vague excuse about not sleeping well, rather than trying to explain what had actually happened, and risk sounding completely insane. And I could never bring myself to walk past that house again, always going out of my way to avoid that particular stretch of street entirely whenever I possibly could, even taking longer routes home just to steer clear of it. Even now, years removed from that night and living a completely different life somewhere else entirely, I still think about it more often than I probably should, especially whenever December rolls around and the air outside carries that same particular cold I remember from that evening. There is something about that specific kind of winter chill, sharp and dry, just starting to bite at your fingers, that drags the whole memory right back to the surface, no matter how many years separate me from it now. My friend has told me he feels the same pull sometimes, certain smells or certain qualities of winter light dragging him right back to that kitchen floor without any warning at all. Neither of us has ever landed on a satisfying explanation for what happened in that house, and at this point, all these years later, I am not sure either of us really wants one. We have tossed around a few half-hearted theories over time, the kind you inevitably come up with for any story that never gets a proper resolution, wondering whether the house had some earlier history neither of us ever learned about, some previous tragedy that might explain both the strange black shape and the constant, restless turnover of owners who never stayed longer than half a year, no matter who moved in. Neither of us has ever actually bothered digging through old property records or local newspaper archives to find out for certain. And I think, deep down, we have both quietly decided we would rather not know. Some things are better left as unanswered questions, rather than mysteries you keep chasing after an explanation that may never come. And that house, whatever it truly was, is one mystery I have simply learned to let rest exactly where it is, rather than dig any further into trying to understand it. Looking back on it now, I sometimes wonder what my life might look like if my friend had reacted differently that night, if he had frozen instead of grabbing me, or if he had not been sitting close enough to notice what was happening to me at all in that empty, unlit kitchen. It is not a thought I like to sit with for very long, but it crosses my mind occasionally, usually late at night, when the house comes up in conversation again, and I find myself running through the sequence of events one more time, trying to imagine how differently things could have gone if even one small detail had shifted along the way. My cousin, who grew up a few streets over from that same neighborhood, once told me she had heard rumors about that particular house from some of her own friends years after I had already moved away. Vague stories about strange sounds and lights that would occasionally be reported by whoever happened to be renting it at any given time, though nothing nearly as detailed or as personal as what my friend and I actually experienced that night. I have never been able to properly verify any of those secondhand rumors, and I have always been a little hesitant to dig too deeply into them myself, worried that confirming even a small piece of it might make the whole thing feel more real and more permanent than I am entirely comfortable with, even now. My cousin's stories aside, I have never personally encountered anyone else who claims to have lived in that house or experienced anything similar there, which somehow makes the whole thing feel even lonelier in a strange way, as though whatever happened that night belongs entirely to the two of us, unshared and unverified by anyone outside our own small circle of two. Sometimes I think that isolation is part of what makes the memory feel so heavy, even now. The fact that there is no wider community of people comparing notes, no online forum full of strangers describing that exact same black shape and that exact same sickly cold, just my friend and me, going over the same handful of details together every so often, unable to move any closer to an actual answer, no matter how many separate times we sit down and revisit it together. Even now, on the rare occasion I find myself back in that part of town for some other unrelated reason, visiting an old classmate or passing through on the way to somewhere else entirely, I make a small, deliberate point of taking a different street whenever possible. Still not quite ready, all these years later, to drive directly past that particular house and see what it looks like today, whether it still sits there empty or whether someone finally settled in for good. I have thought on more than one occasion about actually stopping and standing outside it properly as an adult to see whether it still carries any of that same unsettling weight it did back then, or whether time and distance have worn that feeling down into something more manageable and more ordinary by now. I have never actually gone through with it, and honestly, I am not sure I ever fully will. Every single time I stay at my grandma's house, I hear someone walking around upstairs. It always starts at one side of the room directly above me, casually crossing over to the other side before stopping completely. A slow, unhurried pace that never once varies, no matter how many times I have heard it over the years. This happens roughly twice a night, without fail, every single time I stay there, like clockwork almost, though never at exactly the same time each night. I did not start hearing it until I was about 14 years old, right around when my grandparents made me start sleeping in a different room on the first floor because they had begun sleeping in separate bedrooms for reasons that were never fully explained to me and honestly do not matter much for this particular story. What matters is that both of their bedrooms were also located on the first floor, same as the room I had been moved into, which meant that whatever I was hearing upstairs could not have been either of them moving around up there, no matter how badly I might have wanted that to be the simple explanation. For a little bit of background, I have always been afraid of the upstairs portion of their house, for reasons I have never been able to properly articulate, even to myself. It has simply always unsettled me, ever since I was small, long before I had ever heard a single strange sound coming from up there. Some instinctive dread I could never fully explain to my parents or to anyone else who asked me about it over the years. To this day, even now at 23 years old, I absolutely refuse to go up there alone. I will go up if someone else is with me, but by myself, not a chance. No matter how silly that might sound, coming from an adult who otherwise considers herself a fairly rational person. There is one bedroom upstairs in particular that has always carried a special kind of dread for me, more so than any other part of that already unsettling upper floor, and it is the room that has stayed most vividly present in my mind ever since that first frightening night on the first floor below it. It is a long, narrow room, and when you open the door, there are closets built into the wall on both your left and your right, with a bed positioned roughly in the center of the room, and a single window set into the far wall directly opposite the door. Growing up, my grandparents told me a story about that room, one they had apparently heard from the sons of the family who had owned the house before them. According to that story, those boys used to claim they would see a gorilla emerge from one of the closets at night, dance around the room for a while, and then return back into the closet it had come from. I always thought it was a strange, almost silly story when I first heard it as a kid, the kind of thing that gets passed down as harmless local legend attached to an old house, and I genuinely gave it very little thought at all until the night I am about to describe. The story mostly filed away in my mind as just another quirky bit of family lore about that old house. The room I was moved into on the first floor happened to be located directly beneath that same long, narrow bedroom upstairs, the one with the gorilla story attached to it. I do not think anyone in the family had specifically planned it that way. It was simply the room that became available once the sleeping arrangements shifted. But looking back now, the placement feels significant in a way it never occurred to me to think about at the time. On the night everything started, we had all gone to bed at the usual time, every light in the house switched off, and I was still lying awake in the dark, not quite ready to fall asleep yet. My mind drifting the way it usually does in that quiet stretch of time right before sleep finally takes over. That is when I heard it for the first time. A slow, deliberate thump, followed by another and another, starting from one end of the room directly above me. The sound grew steadily closer as it crossed the room overhead, passing directly above where I lay. and then continued on toward the far end before finally stopping. I was wide awake at that point, genuinely terrified in a way I had rarely experienced before, my whole body suddenly rigid with a fear I could not fully rationalize away, even as I lay there trying desperately to think of some ordinary explanation. There was no question in my mind about what I was hearing. I recognized that slow, casual pace immediately for exactly what it was. Footsteps. Unhurried, deliberate footsteps, walking across the floor directly above my head in a house where every single other person was already accounted for and asleep on the same floor as me. Frightened out of my mind, I got up and went straight to my grandpa's room to tell him what I had heard, my heart still pounding hard as I crossed the short distance between our two rooms in the dark. He listened patiently, the way he always did with me, but ultimately told me the house was simply old, that old houses creak and settle at night, and that was probably all it was. Still, he must have sensed how genuinely shaken I was despite his reassurance, because he got up and turned on the dining room light for me before I went back to my room. A small gesture that made me feel at least a little bit safer as I climbed back into bed that night. I tried to fall asleep again, lying there in the dim glow spilling in from that dining room light, but before long it started right back up, this time beginning from the exact spot where it had stopped before, right by the window upstairs. The footsteps crossed the room once more, passing directly over me again, and stopped when they reached the door on the far side. For a moment I thought that might finally be the end of it, that whatever had passed overhead had simply settled somewhere on the other side of that upstairs room for good. Then, about 5 seconds later, I heard something even worse. I heard it coming down the stairs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, each step distinct and unmistakable, unhurried and deliberate in exactly the same way the footsteps upstairs had been, and then a brief pause of silence as whatever it was reached the landing partway down. Then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, continuing the rest of the way down at that same steady, unbothered pace, followed by another stretch of silence once it reached the first floor, my floor. I was frozen completely in shock, unable to move, unable to think clearly, my whole body locked rigid under the blankets as I tried to process what was actually happening. Whatever this was, it had left the upstairs entirely and was now somewhere on the same level of the house as me. And worse still, it seemed completely unaffected by the dining room light my grandpa had turned on for me, the light I had been relying on to feel even slightly safer just minutes earlier. I lay there, staring at the doorway of my room, the glow from that dining room light spilling in from the hallway across the floor toward my bed, and I began to feel my vision distort slightly. A dizzy, disorienting wave washing over me that I can only attribute to pure, overwhelming fear. I pulled the blankets up over my head, trying to block everything out completely, and that is when I heard a scratching sound coming from somewhere inside my own room, close enough that there was no mistaking it for something happening elsewhere in the house. I knew immediately, without any doubt at all, exactly where that sound was coming from. My grandpa's gun case sat in that room, over against one of the walls, and the scratching was coming directly from it. Long, deliberate scratches dragging down the front of the wooden cabinet door, slow and methodical rather than frantic or accidental. I could even hear the door itself tapping ever so slightly against its frame each time a new scratch began. A small, rhythmic sound that somehow made the whole thing feel even more real and more immediate than everything that had come before it. I tried to scream and found that I could not, my throat completely locked up with fear. No sound coming out, no matter how hard I tried to force it. I forced myself to take one deep, shaking breath, and on the second attempt, I finally managed to let out a loud scream that filled the whole room and, I assumed, most of the house besides. Within seconds, my grandpa came rushing into my room, flipping on the overhead light as he burst through the door, and I have never in my life felt more relieved to see another person standing in a doorway. Needless to say, even after hearing all of this directly from me in that state, breathless and trembling and clearly terrified, he still did not believe that anything unusual had actually happened, chalking it up once again to the ordinary sounds an old house makes settling in the night. So I did what I imagine any reasonable person in my situation would do. I draped a bedsheet over the side of the bed to create a kind of makeshift barrier between myself and the rest of the room, and I slept underneath it that night, wrapped tightly in a comforter with headphones on and my back turned firmly toward the door. At that point, I figured there could have been an entire party of ghosts standing in my room, and I would not have known a single thing about it. And honestly, that felt like a far more comfortable state of ignorance than the alternative of lying there listening for whatever might come next. The next morning, my grandpa mentioned what had happened the night before to my grandma, while the three of us were sitting around the kitchen table, clearly still not taking it very seriously himself, even as he recounted it. She responded almost dismissively, barely glancing up from what she was doing that morning, saying something along the lines of, "Oh, that is silly. You know your cousin woke me up the last time she stayed here, too, coming into my room saying she heard footsteps as well, as though this were simply an unremarkable recurring quirk of the house rather than anything worth further discussion." I slept under that same makeshift shelter of sheets and blankets for the rest of my stay with him that week, unwilling to risk another night fully exposed on top of the bed, no matter how tired or uncomfortable it eventually became. I have stayed at that house countless times since that particular night, and every single time, without exception, I hear those same footsteps again. That same slow, unhurried pace crossing the room above me at least twice each night I stay there. I no longer sleep underneath the bed the way I did that first time, having gradually forced myself back onto the mattress out of sheer necessity more than any real sense of courage, but I still keep my back turned toward the door every single night, and I still sleep with headphones on. A habit I have never fully been able to break since that week, even years later. I have not heard it come all the way down the stairs again since that very first night, and honestly, if it ever does happen again, I am not entirely sure I want to know about it, and I have never once tried to test whether it still would if given the chance. I have thought about that night more times than I could possibly count in all the years since it happened, turning it over in my head again and again the way you do with any experience that never quite settles into a clean, comfortable explanation. Part of me has always wondered whether that old story about the gorilla in the closet had anything real to do with what I actually heard. Whether the two things were somehow connected in some way I could not yet see, or whether I had simply stumbled onto something else entirely on my own. Something that had nothing to do with that old story at all, and had simply been living quietly in that house long before either the gorilla legend or my own family had ever moved in there together. I have never found a truly satisfying way to connect those two pieces together neatly, no matter how many times I have sat and tried, and at this point in my life, I am honestly not sure I ever fully will. My cousin, the very same one my grandma mentioned that morning at the kitchen table, eventually told me her own version of events when I finally worked up enough nerve to ask her about it directly a few years later on. She described almost exactly the same thing I had experienced myself that night. The same slow footsteps crossing the room above her bed. The same unmistakable sense that whatever it was knew exactly where it was going and was in absolutely no hurry at all to get there. She had not, as far as she ever told me, heard it come all the way down the stairs the way I had that very first night, and when I mentioned that particular detail to her, I watched her face go noticeably pale, as though even hearing about it secondhand all these years later was enough to unsettle her all over again just the same. I have never personally worked up the courage to ask my grandparents more directly about the deeper history of that old house, worried that whatever honest answer I might get back would only make things feel more real and more permanent than I am entirely comfortable with even now. Part of me suspects they might know a good deal more than they have ever let on to any of us, given how quickly and how consistently they have always brushed off every single account from every family member who has ever mentioned hearing those same footsteps over the years. Whether that dismissiveness comes from genuine disbelief or from some quieter, more deliberate choice not to discuss it, I honestly could not say, and I am not sure I want to know the answer to that particular question either. My grandma still lives in that same house today, still hosting family gatherings there the way she always has, and every single member of our extended family who has ever spent a night in that house seems to have their own version of this same basic story tucked away somewhere, rarely brought up outright, but always quietly acknowledged with a knowing look whenever the subject happens to surface at a holiday dinner or a quiet moment between relatives. What I do know is that despite everything, I have never once considered refusing to stay there again. My grandma's house has always meant far too much to me, holding far too many good memories built up over decades of holidays and ordinary weekend visits for me to let this one persistent, unexplained detail keep me away entirely. I have simply adapted, the way people do with almost anything given enough time and enough repetition, developing my own small rituals and precautions that let me get through each night there without falling completely apart the way I did that very first time. The gun case scratching has never happened again since that original night either. At least not that I have personally witnessed myself with my own ears, though I still find myself glancing toward it every single time I walk into that room. Some small, involuntary habit I doubt I will ever fully shake, no matter how many uneventful nights pass in between. I sometimes wonder whether that particular detail was somehow tied specifically to that very first encounter alone. Some kind of one-time event, rather than part of the regular, recurring pattern the footsteps themselves seem to consistently follow, though I have no real way of knowing for certain, and I have never felt brave enough to actually test that theory by staying awake and watching for it on purpose. Sometimes, lying there at night with my headphones on and my back turned firmly toward the door, I find myself thinking about those two long-dead sons of the previous owners of that old house, the ones who apparently used to watch a gorilla dance out of that closet upstairs and back in again, wondering whether they ever heard anything similar to what I hear now, wondering whether that whole story might have actually been their own attempt, however strange and roundabout, to describe something they could not otherwise explain to the adults around them at the time. Children often reach for the strangest, most vivid images imaginable when trying to describe something frightening and unfamiliar to the adults around them, and a dancing gorilla, as strange and bizarre as it genuinely sounds when you first hear it, might have simply been the closest thing their own young minds could reach for at the time to explain a shape or a presence they did not yet have better words for. My name is Michael, and I am a 14-year-old boy who lives with my aunt out in the countryside. Where we live, there are no neighbors anywhere close by, the nearest house or any other sign of civilization sitting a good 8 miles away from ours in any direction. Nothing but open fields and stretches of woods separating us from anyone else. I always genuinely loved living out there, since I have always appreciated that kind of isolation and quiet, and the road running past our house stayed completely dead at night, which honestly made for some of the best, most restful sleep I have ever gotten anywhere, None of the usual noise you get from traffic or neighbors keeping me up. My aunt always worked the night shift for her job, which meant that more nights than not, I ended up home completely alone throughout the entire evening and into the early morning hours, something I had grown so used to over time that it barely registered as unusual anymore. On this particular night, I had come home from school after a genuinely miserable day weather-wise. Thunderstorms and steady rain pouring down the entire day and continuing well into the night. The kind of weather that makes everything outside feel gray and distant, even from behind a closed window. I spent that evening the way I usually did on nights like that, playing video games and messaging my friends on Snapchat, just passing the time in whatever way felt most entertaining. At around 9 o'clock, my aunt came upstairs to let me know she was heading off to her job for the night. I was always completely fine with this arrangement, since I genuinely enjoyed having the whole house to myself, free to play music as loud as I wanted, and do basically whatever I felt like doing without anyone else around to bother me about it. Honestly, what teenager would not love that kind of freedom every single night? By around 11 o'clock, I had started feeling genuinely tired, so I laid down in my bed to watch some YouTube videos before eventually drifting off to sleep, which did not take very long at all once I actually settled in. I woke up again at some strange, undefined hour of the night to the sound of somebody knocking on our front door. I sat up in bed, groggy and confused, and muttered something like, "What the hell?" under my breath. I assumed my aunt had come home early from her night shift for whatever reason, and I reluctantly got up to go answer the door for her, checking the small window positioned beside the door out of habit, wanting to confirm it was actually her standing there before I actually opened it up. But there was nobody there at all. I told myself it was probably just some stupid kids messing around, knocking on random doors and running off before anyone could actually catch them in the act. The kind of harmless prank kids sometimes pull on quiet rural roads out of pure boredom, especially on a night with nothing else to do. I dismissed the whole thing pretty quickly and went back to my room, checking my phone as I walked and realizing it was actually 3 in the morning, which immediately made the whole ding-dong ditch theory feel considerably less likely, given that it was a Wednesday night, and I basically lived in the absolute middle of nowhere, miles away from any other kids who might have wanted to pull that kind of prank in the first place, let alone at that specific hour. Just as I was turning that particular thought over in my head, I heard a loud bang coming from somewhere down in the basement. I jumped at the sound immediately, trying hard to convince myself it was simply some noise caused by the ongoing thunderstorm outside. Anything at all to calm my own frayed nerves back down again, telling myself that thunder could easily explain a sound like that if it happened to hit at just exactly the right angle against the house. We always kept our basement door locked anyway, mostly because of my aunt's general paranoia and her persistent fear of someone breaking into the house while she was away at work. A fear that had always struck me as slightly excessive until that exact moment. That was when I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, creaking their way up the old wooden staircase leading up from that same basement, each step landing with a weight that made it clear this was not simply the house settling on its own. Completely frozen with fear at that point, I grabbed my phone and immediately called 911. The operator on the line told me to go find an upstairs room somewhere in the house and grab some kind of weapon to defend myself with if it came down to it. Her voice calm and steady in a way that somehow made the whole situation feel even more real rather than less. But there was absolutely no way I was going to try making my way to the kitchen to grab a knife, especially not once I heard the basement door itself being slammed hard, and quickly realized that whoever was down there was actively trying to bust the door open entirely. The sound of wood straining and splintering carrying clearly up through the floor beneath me. I jumped up from my bed, quietly closed my bedroom door behind me, and hid myself inside my closet. Exactly the way the 911 operator had instructed me to do just moments earlier, crouching down as far back among my hanging clothes as I possibly could manage. This was, without any question whatsoever, the single scariest moment of my entire life up to that point. But then, quite suddenly, the banging from downstairs simply stopped entirely. The silence that followed somehow feeling even worse than the noise itself had. What happened next, though, is something that will genuinely haunt me for the rest of my life. Whoever was down there suddenly screamed at the absolute top of their lungs, but it was not any kind of normal scream a person might make. It was insane sounding, disgruntled, completely unhinged in a way that made my entire body go cold with fear, a sound that did not seem to fit any category of human emotion I could actually name. And then I heard the basement door itself finally collapse entirely under the pressure, the crash of splintering wood echoing up through the house. Now this person was screaming full force as they sprinted up the remaining stairs into the main part of the house, their footsteps heavy and fast against the old, creaking floorboards beneath them. He moved through every single room down our upstairs hallway, still screaming that same horrible, unhinged sound the entire time, until he eventually reached my own bedroom door at the very end of the hall. Unfortunately, my door did not have any kind of lock installed on it at all, and the moment I heard him actually open it, I was completely paralyzed with fear, unable to move or make a sound. I could see him clearly through the narrow slats of my closet door, still screaming as he looked all around my room, checking every corner, even getting down low enough to check underneath my bed itself, his movements frantic and jerky in a way that made him seem even more unpredictable and dangerous. But then, after holding my breath for far too long, trying to stay completely silent, I finally let out a small puff of air I simply could not hold in any longer, my lungs burning from the effort of staying quiet for so long. He immediately perked up at the sound, turning to look directly at my closet, and he stopped screaming entirely, slowly starting to walk toward where I was hiding instead, his silence somehow even more terrifying than the screaming had been only seconds earlier. I genuinely could not breathe at all in that moment, my entire body locked up with terror, especially once he came to a complete stop directly in front of my closet door. I could see him clearly through the slats, and he had the biggest, most unsettling smile I had ever seen on another human being's face in my entire life. An expression that did not match anything else about the situation. Calm and almost pleased in a way that made no sense, given everything else that had just happened. Just as he slowly reached out to grab the closet door handle, there was suddenly a loud bang against the front door of the house. Followed immediately by someone shouting, "Police!" The man immediately took off running, attempting to escape through my bedroom window, but he failed to actually make it out in time. The moment I saw the police officers tackle him to the ground, I instantly bolted out of the closet myself and ran straight outside. A decision I only realized afterward was probably not the smartest move I could have made in that particular moment, given everything that had just happened only seconds earlier. Given that I had no real way of knowing whether he had been working alone or not. After a few minutes had passed, I watched the police officers bring the man out of the house in handcuffs, but as they walked him past me on the way to the patrol car, he turned his head and stared directly at me. That same enormous, unsettling smile still plastered across his face, his eyes looking genuinely, completely deranged in a way I still cannot fully describe properly, even now. A look that felt like it was meant specifically for me alone, as though he wanted me to know he had not been afraid of getting caught at all. Watching him get driven away in the back of that police car was, without question, one of the greatest moments of relief I have ever experienced in my entire life. But even now, what continues to haunt me the most is not the chase itself, or even the sound of that horrible, unhinged scream echoing through our house. It is that specific expression on his face as he stood there directly in front of my closet door, that huge, unsettling smile. Right in the exact moment he was about to reach out and open it, fully prepared to do something genuinely horrible to me had the police not shown up at that exact second. I have thought about that night constantly in the time since it actually happened, replaying the entire sequence of events over and over in my head, trying to make sense of exactly what had brought that man to our house in the first place, out in the middle of nowhere, miles away from any other property or any other potential target he could have chosen instead. My aunt and I never did get a clear, satisfying answer about his actual motive for any of it, at least not one that was ever properly shared with either of us afterward by anyone involved. The police mentioned, in passing, that he had some kind of prior history, though they never went into much specific detail with us about exactly what that history actually involved, leaving us with more questions than actual answers in the aftermath of everything. That first knock on the door, the one that came before any of the real terror actually started, has always stuck with me as one of the most unsettling details of that entire night. Once I actually had time to properly sit down and think it all through carefully. Afterward, I have wondered more than once whether he was testing to see if anyone was actually home and awake before making his move, checking to make sure the house was not going to present any unexpected complications before he actually attempted to break in through the basement door itself. If I had answered that door myself instead of simply checking through the window and going right back to bed afterward, I genuinely do not know how differently that entire night might have played out for me. The basement itself has never quite felt the same to me since that night, even though my aunt eventually had the door reinforced considerably and had an entirely new, much sturdier lock installed not long after everything happened. I still find myself hesitating every single time I need to go down there for any reason, some part of me always half expecting to hear that same slow, deliberate creaking of footsteps on the stairs, even though I know logically that there is genuinely nothing down there anymore beyond our normal storage boxes and the old furnace. Nothing at all that should reasonably give me any cause for concern anymore. My aunt took the whole incident extremely seriously afterward, understandably so, and she ended up having a proper security system installed throughout the entire house within just a few weeks of everything happening. Something we had honestly never felt like we needed before. Given how quiet and consistently uneventful our particular stretch of road had always been up until that specific night, cameras going up over every entry point, including the basement door itself. She also stopped working quite as many night shifts as she used to, at least for a good while afterward, not wanting to leave me home completely alone as often as she previously had. Even though I tried repeatedly to reassure her that I would genuinely be fine on my own, again, understanding completely why she felt the need to be more cautious, regardless of anything I said to try and put her mind at ease. I still think about that 911 operator sometimes, too. The person on the other end of that call who calmly walked me through exactly what to do, in the middle of what was easily the most terrifying experience of my entire life up to that point. Her steady voice somehow managing to keep me focused enough to actually follow her instructions, despite how completely panicked I felt inside. I never did get the chance to properly thank them afterward, and I have occasionally wondered whether they ever found out how everything actually turned out that night. Whether they ever learned that the police genuinely did make it there in time, right at the exact final moment that mattered most. The sound of that man's scream is something I do not think I will ever fully be able to describe properly to anyone who was not actually there to hear it themselves in person. It was not fear, and it was not anger in any way that I could easily recognize or place. It sounded almost like something being simultaneously released and consumed all at once. An unhinged, completely uncontrolled sound that I still sometimes hear echoing in the back of my own mind during quiet, ordinary moments. Completely unprompted and without any warning whatsoever, cutting through whatever else I happened to be thinking about at the time. I've talked to a school counselor about that whole night a handful of times since it happened, trying to properly process everything that took place and everything I actually witnessed and experienced firsthand. Sitting through those sessions, still not entirely sure how to put certain parts of it into words. She has told me more than once that it is completely normal for a specific image or detail from a traumatic experience like that to stick with a person far longer and far more vividly than the actual sequence of events itself often does. In my particular case, that specific detail has always been his smile. That huge, genuinely deranged expression on his face as he stood there directly in front of my closet door, only seconds away from actually opening it and finding me hiding there completely defenseless inside. An image that surfaces in my mind far more often than I would ever like to admit out loud to anyone. I do not know what would have actually happened to me that night if the police had arrived even just a few seconds later than they actually did. I try very hard not to dwell too heavily on that particular thought, but it does still creep back into my mind every so often, usually late at night when the house is quiet and I happen to be lying awake in bed, unable to fall asleep right away. I am endlessly, genuinely grateful that the police showed up exactly when they did, at precisely the right moment, and that I am still here now, alive and safe, able to actually tell this entire story from a place of genuine safety rather than from somewhere considerably worse than where I actually ended up. Even now, whenever a thunderstorm rolls through our particular stretch of countryside, I find myself lying awake a little longer than usual, listening closely to every single sound the house makes around me, half expecting, somewhere deep down, to hear that same distant banging start up again from somewhere down in the basement. I know, rationally, that the actual danger has long since passed and is genuinely over for good at this point. But some small, persistent part of me has never quite been able to fully let go of that specific fear. Not completely, not even after everything that has happened since that single unforgettable night changed so much about how safe I actually feel in my own home. A home that used to feel like the safest place in the entire world to me before that night. And that has never quite felt the same way since, no matter how many locks or cameras we have added to it. When my sister was young, our parents got her a personal phone of her own, a landline specifically for her, so that she could feel special about having something of her very own to use, entirely separate from the rest of the household's shared phone line. She was, admittedly, an extra spoiled kid growing up, and this was very much in keeping with that particular pattern, the kind of gesture our parents made fairly regularly whenever they wanted to make her feel especially cared for or particularly important compared to the rest of us. The phone itself was prepaid, though, meaning that basically nobody at all could actually call in or out on it once she ran out of credit entirely on the account. Functioning in that particular way, somewhat similarly to how a prepaid mobile phone might typically operate under most ordinary circumstances, with a set amount of minutes or credit loaded onto it that simply ran out once it had actually been used up entirely. Every single night, at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, her phone would ring, waking her suddenly from a deep, ordinary sleep with the same unwavering consistency each and every single time it happened. She told us there was always a man on the other line every single time it happened, and she would get genuinely, deeply scared, running straight into my room every single time it occurred, unable to stay in her own room alone with that phone ringing at that exact same hour, night after night. Her small footsteps padding quickly down the hallway toward my door in the dark. This situation eventually escalated to the point where I finally asked her to please just disconnect her phone before going to sleep each night, since it had become genuinely extremely annoying to keep getting woken up every single night by whoever or whatever this person was that kept calling her at that exact same hour. My own patience, wearing thin from the constant disruption to my own sleep on top of hers. To be completely honest, since she was only around 10 years old at the time, I mostly assumed the whole thing was simply connected to these silly, scary movies she liked to watch constantly. Her young imagination running away with her and turning some ordinary technical glitch or wrong number into something considerably more frightening in her own mind. The kind of thing kids that particular age sometimes do without ever meaning to actually deceive anyone about it in any serious way. Eventually, she just got rid of the phone entirely, deciding she genuinely did not want to keep dealing with it any longer, the phone itself disappearing from her room not long after that conversation between us. In any case, I do remember this whole situation actually stopping once she got rid of it. And for a long time afterward, I simply assumed that had been the natural, obvious end of the entire story. Nothing more than a scared kid dealing with an unsettling wrong number or some kind of prank that had simply run its course before eventually stopping on its own. The whole memory settling comfortably into that same unremarkable category as so many other ordinary childhood scares from that same general period of our lives. A few years ago, we happened to be talking about that whole old memory together, reminiscing about our childhood the way siblings sometimes do during those long, meandering conversations that naturally drift toward old, half-forgotten stories from years earlier, and she confessed something to me that I genuinely had no idea about until that exact conversation. She told me that her phone had actually continued ringing even after she had disconnected it entirely, which was the real reason she had ultimately decided she did not want it anymore. Rather than simply being frightened off by ordinary late-night phone calls the way I had always assumed at the time, her voice going a little quieter as she actually told me this detail for the first time in all the years since it originally happened. She told me she has no actual recollection of what the person on the other end of those calls was actually saying to her. Or possibly, she admitted, she had simply completely blocked the entire memory out over the years since it originally happened, unable to say with any real confidence which explanation actually applied to her own situation. Hearing that detail for the first time, all these years later, genuinely changed how I have thought about that entire situation ever since, reshaping a memory I had carried around for years without ever once questioning the comfortable version of events I had always assumed to be true. Growing up, I had always assumed the whole thing was purely a matter of an overactive childhood imagination combined with whatever scary movies she happened to be watching at the time. Nothing more than an ordinary, if persistent, case of nighttime fear that any young kid might reasonably experience under similar circumstances. Learning that her phone had continued ringing even after being physically disconnected entirely completely upended that comfortable, mundane explanation I had been carrying around in my own head for years without ever once questioning it. I have thought a great deal about that specific detail since she first told me. The fact that a disconnected landline, a phone with no active service or credit remaining on the account whatsoever, should not have been capable of ringing at all under any ordinary explainable circumstances. No matter how many times I try to think through the actual mechanics, of how a landline system is even supposed to work. Prepaid landlines, like the one she originally had, do not simply continue functioning once the account itself runs out of credit or gets formally disconnected. There should have been no active line left at all for any call to actually come through on, regardless of who or what might have been attempting to reach her at that point. A basic technical impossibility that has never once stopped nagging at me since I first learned about it. I have also thought about the specific timing involved. That consistent, unwavering 3 in the morning hour, night after night, for what must have been a significant stretch of time before she eventually got rid of the phone entirely. A level of precision that never once wavered across all those weeks or months, at least as far as either of us can actually remember now. That kind of rigid, unwavering consistency has always struck me as one of the more unsettling details of the entire story. Especially now that I know the calls actually continued well beyond the point where any ordinary, technical explanation should have reasonably applied to any of it. I find myself wondering now, with the benefit of that additional context she eventually shared with me, whether I dismissed her fear too quickly and too easily back when we were both still kids ourselves. At the time, I remember feeling genuinely annoyed more than anything else, frustrated at constantly being woken up in the middle of the night by her running into my room in a panic, assuming the whole thing was simply an overactive imagination that would eventually settle down on its own once she got a little older and grew out of that particular phase. The same way most childhood fears eventually fade naturally with age. Looking back now, knowing what I actually know today, I feel a certain amount of guilt over how dismissive I probably was toward her at the time, never once considering that there might have been something genuinely seriously wrong happening rather than simply an ordinary case of childhood nighttime fears. Something I probably should have taken more seriously, even without the full context she only later provided. I have also thought about her specific inability to remember what the man on the other end of those calls was actually saying to her, wondering whether that particular gap in her memory is simply the natural result of how much time has passed since she was originally that young, or whether it actually represents something closer to a genuine, deliberate blocking out of trauma too significant or too disturbing for her young mind to actually hold on to and process properly at the time, a protective mechanism her own brain might have quietly employed without her ever consciously choosing it. She herself raised that exact possibility when she told me about it, admitting she genuinely was not sure which explanation actually applied to her own situation, whether it was simply ordinary childhood memory loss or something considerably more deliberate happening underneath the surface of her own mind. I have asked her, more than once since that original conversation, whether she remembers any additional details beyond what she already told me, any small fragment of a voice or a specific phrase that might have somehow survived in her memory, despite everything else apparently being lost, hoping each time that maybe some small piece might have resurfaced in the intervening months since we last spoke about it. She has told me every single time I have asked that she genuinely does not remember anything more specific than what she already shared with me that first time, that the actual content of those calls remains completely, frustratingly blank in her own memory, no matter how hard she actually tries to recall any additional detail. Her expression always shifting into the same slightly troubled look whenever the subject actually comes up between us. I think about how genuinely frightened she must have been throughout that entire stretch of her childhood, especially now that I understand the calls actually continued even after the phone itself had been formally disconnected. Being a scared 10-year-old dealing with an unsettling prank caller or wrong number is one thing, something plenty of kids might reasonably experience at some point growing up without it ever meaning anything particularly significant. But dealing with calls that continued coming through on a phone that should have had no functional way of actually ringing at all, night after night, at that exact same unwavering hour, is something else entirely. A considerably more disturbing situation for any child to have actually lived through largely on her own, without any real understanding of what was actually happening to her or why. I have wondered more than once since learning this new detail whether our parents ever knew the full extent of what was actually happening with that phone, or whether my sister kept the truth of the continued ringing entirely to herself even after getting rid of the device, the same way she apparently kept it from me for so many years afterward as well, never once mentioning it to either of them at the time, given how young and how frightened she must have been about the whole situation. I have not specifically asked her that particular question directly, though I probably should at some point, mostly out of a lingering hesitation to bring the whole subject back up again and potentially upset her by dwelling on it more than necessary. Worried that pushing for more detail might simply reopen old wounds without actually accomplishing anything useful for either of us. The fact that she eventually chose to tell me about all of this, years after it had originally happened, has always struck me as significant in its own right. A decision I still think about whenever the subject happens to come up between us. She could have easily continued keeping that particular detail to herself indefinitely, letting me continue believing the more comfortable, mundane version of the story that I had always assumed to be true for so many years, without ever once questioning it. Instead, she chose to actually share the full truth with me during that conversation, even though doing so clearly meant revisiting a memory that had apparently unsettled her deeply enough at the time to make her want to be rid of that phone entirely, regardless of any lingering embarrassment she might have felt over how genuinely frightened she had actually been as a kid. I do not know, even now, what actually caused those calls to keep coming through on a disconnected line, night after night, at that exact same hour, or who or what that man on the other end of the line actually was. And I doubt either of us will ever actually arrive at any kind of satisfying, complete answer to that particular question. I have no way of actually verifying any part of her account beyond her own memory of it, since I never personally witnessed any of it happening myself, only ever hearing about it secondhand. First, through her frightened, panicked visits to my room as a kid, and then years later through that single, considerably more unsettling conversation where she finally revealed the full truth of what had actually been happening to her all along. I have thought about reaching out to our parents directly to ask whether they remember anything additional about that entire situation from their own perspective, whether they ever personally witnessed the phone ringing themselves at any point, or whether they simply took my sister's word for it at the time without ever directly experiencing any part of it firsthand, trusting her account entirely without ever actually needing to verify it themselves. I have not actually done this yet, mostly out of some lingering uncertainty about whether bringing the whole subject back up again would genuinely accomplish anything meaningful, or whether it would simply reopen an old, uncomfortable memory that everyone involved has mostly managed to move past by this point in our lives. Better left resting quietly in the past, rather than dredged back up again for reasons that might not actually serve anyone well. My sister and I have not talked about this particular story much since that one conversation years ago where she first told me the full truth of it, the subject settling back into a kind of quiet, unspoken understanding between the two of us rather than something either of us has actively pursued further. It comes up every so often, usually during those same kinds of nostalgic late-night conversations where old childhood memories tend to naturally resurface. But neither of us has ever really pushed to dig much deeper into it, beyond what she already shared with me that first time. I think, in some ways, we have both simply learned to accept it as one of those strange, permanently unresolved family stories that will likely never actually receive any kind of satisfying explanation, no matter how many more years continue to pass between now and when it originally happened all those years ago. I still think about that phone sometimes, wondering what actually became of it after my sister finally got rid of it for good, whether it ended up in some landfill somewhere, its ringer finally permanently silenced, or whether it somehow continued causing trouble for whoever might have ended up with it afterward, assuming it was ever actually passed along to anyone else at all, rather than simply being thrown away entirely and left to sit quietly in some garbage heap somewhere, its strange purpose entirely unknown to anyone who might have encountered it after that. I do not know the answer to that particular question either, and at this point I have mostly made peace with the fact that I probably never will. The same way my sister has apparently made her own quiet peace with never fully remembering exactly what that man on the other end of those calls was actually saying to her all those years ago. A small, permanent gap in her own memory that she has simply learned to live alongside rather than continuing to chase after some explanation that may never actually come. I have also thought, more than once, about how differently that entire situation might have played out if either of us had actually understood what was truly happening back when we were both still kids ourselves, rather than only piecing the full truth together decades later during one single unplanned conversation. Would our parents have handled things any differently at all if they had known the calls actually continued well after disconnection, taking the whole situation considerably more seriously than they apparently did at the time, treating it as something requiring real intervention rather than simply a phase their youngest daughter would eventually grow out of on her own? I do not know the answer to that particular question either, and I recognize now, with the benefit of some distance and perspective, that it is probably not a particularly useful thing to spend too much time dwelling on, given how genuinely impossible it truly is to actually go back and change anything at all about how that whole situation actually unfolded all those years ago now. I think more than anything else, what has stayed with me most from learning the full truth of this story is simply how much a person can carry quietly on their own, even from a family member as close as a sibling, for years and years without anyone else around them ever having the slightest idea. My sister lived through something genuinely frightening as a young child, something considerably stranger and more disturbing than the ordinary nighttime fear I had always assumed it to be growing up alongside her, and she carried that particular truth privately for years afterward, before ever actually choosing to share it with me in full. I have wondered since then what other small, similarly unspoken memories might still be sitting quietly between the two of us even now, waiting patiently for the right late-night conversation to finally bring them back out into the open again after all this time has already passed. A friend of mine told me this story about a year ago, and I still think about it more than I would like to admit. She heard it from someone close to her, a woman we can call Minji, who was in her late 20s at the time and working as a private English tutor in South Korea. Minji lived alone in a small one-room apartment, the kind that is common in busy Korean cities, where the bed, the kitchen, and the living space are all part of the same small room. She had built a quiet, steady routine for herself, tutoring students in the evenings and going home to that same small apartment every night. Nothing about her life seemed unusual, which is part of what makes this story so unsettling. It shows how something can be sitting quietly in the middle of an ordinary life for a long time before anyone notices. One of her regular students was a high school boy, someone she had been tutoring for a while and had built a comfortable, friendly relationship with. The kind of relationship a tutor often has with a student they see several times a week. On this particular evening, they had a long study session that ran later than usual. The two of them had been focused on preparing for an upcoming exam, going over vocabulary and grammar late into the night, the way students in Korea often do when a big test is approaching. Time slipped away from them without either one really noticing, until Minji finally looked at the clock and realized just how late it had gotten. By the time they finished, the last bus of the night had already come and gone. The boy lived far from her apartment, far enough that getting home would have meant a long walk through empty streets in the middle of the night, or an expensive taxi ride that he was not prepared to pay for. He looked at Minji, a little nervous, and asked if he could just stay on her floor until morning, then catch the first bus home at sunrise. Minji hesitated. She was a grown woman living alone, and he was a teenage boy, her student no less, and something about the idea of him spending the night in her apartment felt uncomfortable to her right away. It was not really about trust in him specifically. It was about how it looked, how it felt, and what could go wrong, even with the best intentions. But he kept asking, explaining that he had nowhere else to go at that hour, and that he really did not want to spend money on a taxi that late at night. After a lot of back and forth, and feeling a bit worn down by his persistence, she finally agreed, telling herself it was just one night, and that he could sleep on the floor while she took the bed, as if that arrangement made the whole situation feel more proper and controlled. They walked back to her apartment together through the quiet streets, the city much emptier at that hour than during the day. Once inside, she pulled out a spare blanket and a pillow, laid them out on the floor near the foot of her bed, and told him that was where he would be sleeping. He thanked her, seeming genuinely grateful, and settled down for the night while she climbed into her own bed just a few feet away. It was a strange arrangement, she later admitted, having a teenage student sleeping on her floor in the same small room where she slept. But exhaustion eventually won out over any lingering unease, and both of them fell asleep not long after turning off the lights. The apartment was quiet for the next few hours, the kind of stillness that settles over a small home late at night when the rest of the world outside has slowed down too. Then, sometime around 2 in the morning, Minji felt someone gently shaking her awake. She opened her eyes, disoriented, and saw the boy kneeling beside her bed, his face lit only by the faint glow of streetlight coming through the window. He told her he was hungry, that he really wanted to eat something right then. Minji, still half asleep and more than a little annoyed, told him it was 2 in the morning, that this was not the time to be thinking about food, and that he should just go back to sleep and eat something when the sun came up. But he did not lie back down. He kept insisting, telling her he could not fall back asleep, that his stomach was bothering him, that he really needed something to eat right now. Trying to end the conversation quickly so she could go back to sleep, Minji told him there was instant ramen in the kitchen cabinet, and that he was welcome to make himself a bowl if he was really that hungry. That should have been the end of it, an easy solution that let her close her eyes again. But he shook his head, saying he did not want ramen, that he specifically wanted to go to a certain 24-hour restaurant, just a short walk down the road, the kind of small, late-night spot common in Korean neighborhoods that never really close. Minji tried to talk him out of it, telling him it was too late, that they should just wait until morning, but he kept pushing, his voice taking on an odd urgency that did not quite match a normal request for a midnight snack. Looking back, she said there was something in the way he was speaking, something just slightly too insistent, too strange for the situation, though at the time she brushed it off as typical teenage stubbornness and hunger. After several minutes of him refusing to let the subject drop, Minji finally gave in, mostly just to stop the back and forth and get him to be quiet. She sat up, put on a jacket over her pajamas, grabbed her keys, and told him they could go to the restaurant quickly if it would finally let her get some sleep afterward. He nodded, visibly relieved, and the two of them left the apartment together, stepping out into the cold, empty street in the middle of the night. The hallway outside her apartment was dim and silent. The elevator ride down equally quiet, both of them too tired to make much conversation. The moment they stepped outside onto the street, away from the building and away from the apartment, the boy's entire demeanor changed. He stopped walking, turned to face her directly, and in a low voice, no longer talking about food at all, told her the real reason he had woken her up. He said that while he was lying on the floor trying to fall asleep, from his position down on the ground, he had a clear line of sight underneath her bed, a view she herself never had from her angle up on the mattress. And in that narrow space under her bed, he told her he had seen a man, a grown man, lying completely still, hidden underneath her bed frame, in the dark, just inches from where she had been sleeping the entire time. He told her he panicked the moment he saw him, but he did not want to say anything out loud while they were still inside the apartment, afraid of what the man might do if he realized he had been spotted. So instead, the boy had come up with the excuse about being hungry, something normal and harmless enough to get both of them safely out of the apartment and away from whoever, or whatever, was hiding underneath her bed. It was, in hindsight, an incredibly quick and clever way for a teenager to think under pressure, using a fake craving for midnight food as a way to protect both himself and his tutor without alerting the stranger hiding just a few feet away from where they had both been sleeping. Minji said her whole body went cold standing there on that empty street, the reality of what he was telling her slowly sinking in. She had been sleeping in that apartment, alone for who knows how long, completely unaware that there was another person hiding in that same small room with her every single night. She thought about all those nights she had gone to bed without a second thought, feeling safe in her own space, never imagining that just a few feet below her, someone else might have been lying there in the dark, listening to her breathe, waiting, watching the room from underneath the very bed she slept on. Standing outside on the street, shaking, both of them called the police right away, too afraid to go back inside the apartment on their own to confirm what the boy had seen. When the officers arrived, they went into the apartment with Minji watching from a distance and confirmed exactly what the boy had described. There was a man hiding underneath her bed, curled up in the tight space between the floor and the bed frame, and the police were able to pull him out and take him into custody without much resistance. As it turned out, this man was homeless and had somehow been staying in her apartment, sleeping under her bed for a stretch of over 2 months, only leaving during the hours when she was away at work or out tutoring, careful enough or lucky enough to never be caught in all that time. The thought of it kept Minji up for weeks afterward, she told my friend, not because anything violent happened, because thankfully it did not, but because of everything it implied. 2 months is a long time. That meant this man had learned her entire daily schedule, knew exactly when she left in the mornings and exactly when she usually came home at night, understood the rhythm of her life well enough to move freely in and out of her space without ever being noticed. It meant he had likely gone through her belongings while she was away, had eaten food from her kitchen at some point, had used her space as if it were partly his own, all without her ever suspecting a single thing. What frightened her most, she later admitted, was not really the danger itself, since nothing physically happened to her, but the sheer amount of time this had gone on, completely unnoticed. She had gone to bed dozens of nights in that same room, feeling perfectly safe, locking her door out of simple habit, never once suspecting there was someone else present the entire time, close enough to reach out and touch if he had wanted to. It was the kind of realization that changes how a person feels about safety altogether. The understanding that feeling safe and actually being safe are not always the same thing, and that sometimes danger can be patient enough to hide in plain sight for months without ever making a sound. After that night, Minji moved out of that apartment as quickly as she could arrange it, unable to stand the thought of spending even one more night in that same room, knowing what had been happening there for so long without her knowledge. She found a new place to live, one with better security. And she has told my friend more than once that she still cannot fully explain the mix of relief and horror she felt in the days that followed, grateful that nothing worse had happened, but shaken to her core by how close and how long it had actually gone unnoticed. She has also said, more than once, that she owes a great deal to that student of hers, whose sudden, strange request for food in the middle of the night, something that had irritated and confused her at the time, turned out to be the only reason she found out at all. If he had simply gone back to sleep that night instead of insisting on going out to eat, there is no telling how much longer that man might have continued living underneath her bed, undiscovered, or what might eventually have happened if he had ever been caught or noticed some other way, in some other moment, when no one else happened to be there to help her. Whenever I think about this story, what stays with me is not some dramatic jump scare or sudden moment of violence, but the quiet horror of it. The idea that something can be present in your life, close enough to touch, for months at a time, while you go about your normal routine completely unaware. It makes me think about how much we simply trust the spaces we live in, how rarely we check under the bed or behind the closet door, because we assume that our home is only ever occupied by us. Minji's story is a reminder that assumption is not always true, and that sometimes the most frightening things are not the ones that jump out at you in the dark, but the ones that have been there quietly all along, waiting.